Hello and welcome to the next edition of the Hack the Planet podcast, the only podcast that trusts the IOMMU about as much as an IOU. We are joined today by a very special guest and a longtime friend, Ilja van Sprundel, the director of PenTest at IOActive. Oh, say hello.
Hello.
Hey. Now, Ilja won't admit to this himself because he's incredibly modest, but he is one of the best C code auditors I've seen work in person. Basically, tied for the top slot. So I'm very excited to pick his brain about his like how he approaches C code audit and finding bugs and that kind of thing. We're also joined by our usual panel. We have Dan. Say hello, Dan.
How's it going, guys?
And our editor and producer, Mitchell.
Howdy.
Awesome. So, Ilja, first question. So, I know this confuses a lot of Americans, but you're from Belgium, but you live in the Netherlands.
No, I actually do live in Belgium, but I spent some time in the Netherlands for university. So I lived there for about a year, but I actually do live in Belgium.
Oh, okay.
But I did live in America for a couple of years.
Yeah, well, as a security consultant, you spend an enormous amount of time on the West Coast, which is
Yep.
how we've crossed paths.
That's true.
But I think a lot of people are around here just get confused that Belgium and the Netherlands are different countries.
Yeah, we share a language, and once upon a time we were, before 1830, we actually were the same country. And since, I mean, there were a couple of wars where technically we were part of the same Reich in the early 1900s, and so back in the couple of centuries ago, there were times when we were the same country. But since 1830, we've been fairly consistently our own country.
I was this many years old before I learned that piece of European history. Like that's literally never come up. Like they didn't cover that in high school here.
It's really funny because we had a big war in 1830 for our independence from the Dutch, and they only recognized our independence 9 years later in 1839. And so to this very day, the dates of when Belgium existed differ whether you go to school in the Netherlands or in Belgium, because the Dutch will teach their children 1839, and here in Belgium, our teachers teach us that it's 1830.
Wow. Because it didn't get recognized by one side till 9 years later.
Correct.
That's very confusing. So when they celebrate the like how many years Belgium has been a country, do they subtract the 2 years where there was no government?
No, we see it as 1830 because that's when we declared we were a country.
Okay. So boy, yeah. So normally when we have guests, we'd go through their conference talks in some level of detail. But with you, that's going to be impossible, simply because of the volume of your output in the last 20 years or so. So looking at just your CCC talks, there are seven talks on the CCC site that we'll have links to in the episode notes, in addition to other conferences. So I actually, do you have any idea how many conference talks you've given?
In total, I don't know exactly how many. I have a fairly update list on my resume. I think it's between 50 and 60, but I'm not exactly sure what I can get you a number. I can find out, but I don't know exactly how many off the top of my head.
Yeah, that seems about right. So we're not going to be able to go through all of those in detail. Although this podcast does run quite long, it doesn't run that long. But I would like to skim over some of the more interesting ones a little bit later.
Sure.
But if now that we've established your credentials as just a massive source of insight into bug finding and exploit development, as we ask everybody, I'm really curious how you got into this in the first place. Like what got you into InfoSec? What got you into C code audit specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's with most origin stories, it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where things started. I guess when I was a kid, like a teenager, like 12, 13, I was interested in computers, and then hacking. I mean, it was one of, like, I played games and other things, and hacking was just one of them where I was like, oh, that's interesting. Let me play around with that. And of course, I started off with sort of the standard script kiddie stuff, combined with spending way, way too much of my time on IRC. And in fact, IRC is where I found my very first kind of bug, or at least I thought it was a cool bug. Looking back, it was pretty lame, but there was this really minor bug in MIRC, which I was using at the time, which is the IRC client a lot of people were using because it was like the de facto IRC client for Windows.
Did you buy a license?
Oh man, I did at a later time buy a license once I had a job, because I figured I'd use it for so much time, I might as well buy a license. Here's the thing though, the MRC license at the time was a lifetime license. And about 2 or 3 years ago, the guy that owns MIRC decided that's no longer true, and he voided old lifetime licenses. You have to buy a new one. And when I recently had to install MIRC for something, and I tried my key and it didn't work, and it really pissed me off because I bought a lifetime license that's no longer a lifetime license. Anyway, so the very first bug I found was a very minor bug in MIRC, which I think has since been fixed, but it was a weird spoofing bug where you could, you had these color codes in MIRC, or in IRC in general. And so you could join a channel that had like someone's channel name, but you add a color code to it. And it's a different channel, but in MIRC, if you did a whois, they filtered out the color code, so it showed up as if you were in that channel. So you could pretend to have like an @ sign in a channel that you didn't, so it looked you up, which is, I mean, it's not very interesting, but it's a minor spoofing bug. And that was the very first bug I ever found, like, by myself. I think it's long been fixed, and obviously it's pretty lame, but at the time I was very proud of it, because it's like, 14-year-old kids, like, your very first bug ever. And then with that, back then, the big websites for like this kind of stuff was like Packet Storm, and Security Focus, which I guess just closed down, unfortunately. And so from there, I'd done a little bit of programming before, like I learned a little bit of BASIC, and I got a little bit of Pascal at school. And then from just looking at those websites and trying to, like, do the script kiddie thing and run exploits, and then you want to modify them a little bit and you want to like write your own version of something. So I learned some Perl. But even back then, a lot of the exploits were written in C. So at some point I was like, I have to learn C, which has been sort of a lifetime process. I'd say the first 5-6 years of it, I was really bad at it, but I could like write a basic socket client and stuff like that. And so anyway, from there, I kind of learned those things. And then gradually, as you sort of move out of script kiddiehood and learning things, I was all, because this was sort of the era of like all these hacking groups. So I kind of started my own, and then that led into joining a local Belgian hacking group, which was called SecureAx. And there's a lot of history there too. If you want, we can definitely talk about that. But from there, I moved into a Dutch hacking group. And even back then, the Dutch had a much bigger and richer hacking scene than Belgium ever did. And so there were some really smart and interesting characters in that group. That was Netric. And that's where I met up with these folks, and really we got into like, how to do buffer overflows and format string bugs. And this was late 90s, early 2000s, so the heap overflows were just coming around, and we're learning to explore integer overflows. And so at the time we didn't do that much bug finding, but we were just focused on like improving our exploit writing skills. And so about a few years into that, 2002, 2003, we got pretty good at it. We published some interesting stuff. And so we were like, okay, now that I'm fairly good, at least at the time, this is a skill I haven't maintained, so I'm not very good at writing exploits today, but back then I could keep up with everything that was there. Because I did some return to libc and, doing non-executable stack and non-executable heap and some early ASLR stuff. And so I was like, okay, well, now that I'm fairly good at writing exploits, I should figure out how to actually find these bugs. So I spent some time learning how to audit C code, which is an ongoing process. And I mean, the first couple of months are hard because this is not an easy thing to get into. But once you get over that initial hurdle, I learn new things every day, but after that sort of initial couple of months, you start finding like your first bug, like some string copy stuff, and then it gets into more complicated stuff. And then I remember when I was in college, I sort of got to the point where I was good enough that I could find bugs in like most things. And that kind of depressed me for a little while because it like really hit me on a practical level that like everything is broken, right? And not just as like a statement, but like you could hand me a piece of C code and I'll probably find a buffer overflow in it, right? And that that realization really did kind of depress me for a couple of weeks. And then I was like, okay, well, I just have to fucking get over it because I can try to make things better, but that's the way it is. I mean, turns out writing C code's very hard, and unless you're a group of very, very niche, crazy developers, you don't stand much of a chance. Although I will say, in the last 20 years, that has really improved. I mean, we've, as a community, that we or the C developers have certainly learned a lot since the mid to late 90s. There's a number of things where we now go like, okay, that's just stupid. Like most of libc is out, right? Like string copy is a bad idea. String end copy is a bad idea. sprintf, snprintf is like all. And so we've sort of discarded a lot of that and sort of came up with, okay, here's a better function, string lcat, right? Stuff like that. Things like null terminated strings, probably a bad idea. Let's go make our own string structures or string classes. And similarly for data structures, let's have things that contains unsigned ints for lengths, and let's make sure we work with that. And so there's definitely been huge improvements. But back then, like early 2000s, we had, even though some of people knew, like Dan Bernstein was well aware of these things, but it wasn't like generally accepted knowledge. And so upon having that realization, that kind of got me down for a while. And then I got over that. And then, it turns out I didn't really like university. So after my first year, a couple of things happened. I didn't like the first year. I hated going to school. I hated high school. I hated middle school. And I figured university was going to be different. It's going to be great. We're going to be adults amongst each other. And of course, it was just the same kind of bullshit. And so, after first year, I was a little bit like, what am I doing with my life? But then at the same time, at the end of my first year in university, a friend of mine gave me a link to this website, which was called the Summer School of IT Security. This was at a university in Germany, and you could submit your quote unquote academic resume, and which I didn't have that much of because I was only a first year. But I had done some interesting things in part of Netric. We had done some exploits and some code review, and we'd written some tools for like network spoofing and like infection engines and stuff like that. So I created a quote-unquote academic resume based on that. And I sent it in, and then through the summer break, totally forgot about it. And this was supposed to happen at the end of the summer break. And so near the end of my summer break, I got an email saying, I'm accepted. We're starting in like 2 weeks. It's a 3-week thing. And it's supposed to be like a whole semester. And I joined there, and it was this liberating experience. Like my mind was blown. I was the youngest kid there. I was surrounded by a bunch of these like PhD postdocs, people that had spent, already 10 years, mostly in academia, but doing security stuff. And I mean, guys from like Cambridge, like prestigious universities. And I was among my peers. Like I loved it so much. I was just blown away by how awesome it was, where I could really apply all of these things I kind of already know. And I learned a lot in those 3 weeks. And so I made a decision right there at the end of those 3 weeks. Like, I was like, I don't want to go back to school and do long division for another 4 years. I want to do this now. Like, I'm going to go out and find a job. And I actually remember telling my instructor at the Summer School of IT Security the last day, that like his course was my realization that I have to drop out of university and get a job. Now this guy was a university professor, so he was a little bit offended that he had pushed that like his course had like been my realization of like I should quit school and get a job. But short of that, my biggest fear was telling my parents that I was going to drop out because they had invested some money in this. But my mom was very, very supportive of it, and so I did that. Of course, the problem with dropping out of university and trying to find a job is that nobody wants to hire a university dropout, or certainly back then no one wanted to hire a university dropout. So even though I dropped out, it took me 6 months to get my first job. And even that sort of went back to, wasting years of my life in IRC finally paid off because it was an IRC buddy of mine who decided, like, I'm going to do a security startup. And I was employee number 2. And that was a company called SureStack, which no longer exists. But that then just got me into doing, security work. And then in around 2006, I ended up doing my first consulting engagement at Microsoft, which was a huge blast doing some security reviews for Windows Vista. But one of the things there is I met a guy named Dan Kaminsky, who I think most people on this podcast know. And Dan, and I remember at some point talking to Dan that like I love to work, but the company I work for is a failing startup, and like paychecks are late, and like I'm looking to like jump ship. And Dan was like, "Oh, great! You should come work at IOActive." And then that's what happened. And now we're into I think late 2007, and that's where I met Ben. And then right. And so from there on, I mean, that's just sort of snowballed into where we are today. But then in like that's more or less my origin story. Was there anything else there that you wanted to ask or follow up on, or
that I've known you a long time, but I had never heard about the summer school of IT security part before, and that's actually super fascinating to me. It's interesting to me, like what kind of training program you could make to make people into better security people. If you kind of pointed it at younger people or people getting into it. And you're, like one of the best security people of all time. So I'm really interested in what this transformative experience was like in a little bit more detail. Like what did you do in those 3 weeks?
That's a great question. So it basically, and I can go. I think the website is still around there somewhere, and if not, it's on archive.org. But it was really split up into a bunch of things. So there was web hacking, there was network hacking, there was forensics, there was exploit writing, and probably a bunch of others. And the exploit stuff, obviously at the time I understood pretty well. The network stuff I had some experience with as well. The forensic stuff I at the time knew absolutely nothing about, and certainly as was common back then. If you're doing like the quote unquote elite C stuff, people kind of look down on the web stuff. So I never had much web hacking experience when I was there because it was kind of seen as like less these people that don't know how to write C code but it was really mind blowing because we had a really, really good instructor, and like I knew about cross-site scripting bugs, but I never really cared. But one of the things that really blew my mind is like this instructor was very hands-off, very practical, clearly had experience. And one of the things that blew my mind the most is so the way this was set up is they had classes in the morning and then there was a lab in the afternoon, and it was very packed. So the labs would run into the evenings and sometimes nights. I remember doing 2 all-nighters there where I would just wouldn't go back to where I was staying and just stay the whole night. And so on the web stuff, one of the things they showed in the morning was they said, okay, here's SQL injection, here's how it works. And then they move into, okay, well, what if it's blind? And they get into like blind SQL injection exploitation, and like how do you try to get some info out of it, and then do like binary lookups and like if something either the only response you get is fail or success, and how you can use that to try to like do a binary search for like bits and bytes into like passwords and stuff like that. And I'd never thought about I mean, I understood SQL injection conceptually, but I never thought about it at that level. And that was sort of where I was like, whoa, this is actually really cool. I should learn more about this. Similarly, for the forensic stuff, I mean, I knew at a high level what forensics was, but I'd never done it. And so what they had done at the school, and this was so awesome, is the week before we came there, they just went on eBay and just bought a bunch of shitty secondhand hard disks. And they said, "Here are the hard disks." And then in the morning they had showed us some of the tools. So there was the open source stuff. So it's like Sleutkit and stuff like that. I mean, nothing truly brilliant, but these tools work, right? And so they said, "Here's the hard disks. You know, take a. I think it wasn't even stated. Take an IDE cable and hook it up, and use Sleutkit and whatnot. And tell us what's on these disks. Have they been wiped? Have they not been wiped? What was there before?" And we got, I think one of them was from an old accounting office. The other one was like a cash register. I don't remember what all the others were. But this blew my mind that you could just go on eBay, find these disks, use these tools, and you could find all this data that people just didn't bother to delete, right? Accounting records. I mean, that's crazy, right? So there was all of that in the school. And then, I mean, just the people alone, my view of university at the time was like, we're all there because we kind of have to, and you're all taking these classes that a lot of them you're not really interested in. Like, I had to take a management class in university. I had to I took, some really boring math classes. And I can look back at that later because I actually do have I kind of like math now, but at the time I hated it mostly because I was told I had, like, someone holds the gun to your head, say, go do this. And I was like, no, I don't care. But so I didn't really like university. And so, and around me, there were plenty of people who didn't really care that much for it either. They're just there for the degree. But I'm at this other academic institution now with people that are clearly passionate and driven, and they love the security stuff. And I loved it too, right? And just that whole experience was just the most wonderful thing ever. And it ended with like a 2-day kind of capture the flag hacking challenge kind of stuff, where it was set up by the people that had like created this, where you had to utilize all of the skills and things that they had shown in the previous 2.5 weeks to like complete these levels and like, get to where they want you to get. It was just, everything about it was wonderful. And in fact, I liked it so much, and I think I got along really well with the instructors as well, is that they did it again the next year. And they actually did it twice next year. Once was again for students, and then the other one was a commercial version. Now, when it happened again the next year, the academic version, they actually asked me to come back and like do a presentation, like as a guest speaker for the new students. And I spread the word, so I told all my friends, like, this thing's really cool, and so on and so on and so forth. And so two of my friends ended up doing that same class the year after. And yeah, I mean, it was a mind-altering experience. It's just, so the main instructor there was a guy named Maximilian Dornsive, who for a while published some security stuff as well. He later, his family owned a family business, so he later quit academia and went to run the family store. But that guy really changed my life. I was in university, not really know what I did, and because the work he did, I'm doing what I love to do. So it had just those 3 weeks had an enormous influence on like the rest of my life.
Wow. So it was just that it was hands-on, it was really intense, and it was obviously very well constructed.
Oh, it was very well constructed. It was unbelievably well constructed. And yeah, as you said, hands-on, super intense. And just, I don't know how they selected the group of people they did, but it worked just so well. Everyone was there loving it. And just, like, we were all focused on doing this one thing. And yeah, we would all show up at like 8 or 9 in the morning. And then we'd have lunch, and then it'd be the afternoon, the lab, and that would just run. There was no end date, right? So I did 2 all-nighters where and of course, that's a lot easier when you're 21 than, when you're our age.
Yeah.
But even back then, no one made me do it. I did it because I wanted to, right? Because this was fascinated me.
Wow.
Yeah. Especially the forensics part isn't something that you see a lot of, training guided at newer folks in the field.
Absolutely, yeah, and they should, because I remember that being so. That and the web stuff were the things that blew my mind. Like the network stuff, I understood, and I like doing network stuff, and the explanation stuff. I actually they have these things called coffee table talks, which is the idea is that every afternoon at around 4, any one of the students had to like get up and spend 5 to 10 minutes talking about something. And so mine was about, I think I spoke about format string bugs. So of all the people that were there, I think I was probably the most versed at the exploitation part. But the web, and especially the forensic stuff, that's just because I didn't know anything, and just seeing how cool it was totally blew my mind. And obviously the web stuff is well known throughout the industry, but the forensic stuff is something that you should really do, because just the concept of like, here's a hard disk, go use the tools, see what you actually find. It's stunning how surprising and entertaining that really is to a new kid coming into this.
And I mean, I still use SleuthKit.
I mean, their work.
It's been updated. It's a nice free alternative to something like Encase or whatever, like the commercial tool.
So wait, that is still being maintained? I didn't know that.
Yeah, last I checked. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a boot disk. You can boot to it. It has it'll show you like the NTFS journal and works on all file systems. It has all the utilities to like undelete stuff. Yep. Yeah, we'll link to that in the notes. It's a good time.
It's also been expanded to, I guess, also target different file system formats. I guess people are now using it for mobile analytics.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's a companion tool called Autopsy with it.
Oh yeah,
that rings a bell. Yeah, I know Autopsy. Yeah, although I think at the time that may not have existed yet.
No, it definitely didn't.
It definitely didn't.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd be super interested in the format, and like it sounds more like a real boot camp. They have like these coding dojos. They call it like like a coding boot camp or whatever. But really, the actual syllabus for those is they sit people down and they kind of just like walk through some lessons and try and spoon feed it, right? And this is more like military boot camp.
Yeah, no, it was a whole
someone
trimester.
Yells at you at 4 a.m. and you have to run 20 miles or something.
Well, I mean, they were nicer about it because they're all geeks, but pretty much. And so but it was literally a whole trimester packed into 3 weeks. I mean, it was action-packed. And what's really cool about it is there's actually an academic paper about how this IT security, summer school of IT security went, like all things we did, that was created by the people that did this. I can dig up the paper. I think it was actually even in English. It should still be out there. If I find it, I can send you the link. It's a wordy read,
yes.
and it every so often, every couple of years, like I'll somehow run into it and I'll read it again, and it's like it's pure nostalgia because I was there, and it's just all these beautiful, positive feelings coming back.
Well, I mean, I think the proof is in the pudding, right? Like this program produced an Ilja. So the world needs more Ilyas. Therefore, maybe we should go back and look at what this was.
Yeah, I'm all for it. There should definitely be more programs like this. It was a huge blast, and I think it definitely had a lasting effect on me.
Awesome. Well, so changing gears a little bit. Well, I was also interested. You mentioned Netric.
Yeah. Okay. So
do you want to talk a little more about that?
Sure, I can talk about that. So this is we're talking early 2000s now. So this was sort of at the height of the sort of hacking groups. We had AMD and WooWoo and they were all much bigger and better than we were. But we had Netric, which was it's about 10 or so people. So it was 2 people from Belgium, me and another guy, and then there were 8 or 9 guys from the Netherlands. And we had our own website and our own IRC server, and we would do these occasional meetings, and it was all just a bunch of security nerds talking about stuff, writing exploits and tools. I think one of our guys even made a quote unquote secure Linux distro. I mean, nothing like GR2 like that, but sort of what we thought it was going to be like at the time. And just we did some papers. And I mean, and a lot of it obviously was based in IRC as things were back in the day. So I wasted way too much time of my life on our Netric IRC. But we were talking to each other every day, hours every day. And even mostly tech stuff, but even I remember there being like one part where it was, at least for me, a little bit more like a support group where it was my last year in high school and we were supposed to do this really shitty like final work that I didn't care about. And of course, it was 3 days before I had delivered this thing and I hadn't done anything. And so I worked like crazy for those 3 days and I was like really stressed out. Like, cause if you fail that, you fail high school, like you don't get your degree. And I remember one of the guys there going like, oh, like he was like cheering me on as I was stressing through this stuff. So there was all of that. And I mean, just the people from there alone, I mean, there's definitely lasting relationships there because there's people, I mean, obviously I don't talk to these people every day, but there's a number, I mean, some people I've lost contact with, but some people I still talk to. So one of them, he went by the handle SD, but this is a guy named Richard Van Eden, who, Ben knows him, right? So I got him to join initially as I worked at SureSec, and then when I moved from SureSec to IOActive, I got him into IOActive as well. And so he worked there for a number of years and then moved on to Microsoft. He was very successful there. And now I think he's at Amazon and he's being very successful there. There was another guy in Netric named Gorny, who was a very, very tall guy, which isn't too rare because the Dutch are, I think they're like the tallest people in the world. But he's 6'10" or something. He's very, very tall. And eventually I got him to join IOActive as well. And he recently started his own thing. So he's now doing his own security consulting group. But just all these people have had. I mean, I worked with them. We laughed with them. Met up with them. We've sort of still interacted on a both work and kind of friend basis.
Yeah, and they've had kind of big careers too. And I've worked with some of these people, and they're all pretty amazing. Like Richard is amazing.
Yeah, no, that guy's a massive rock star, and it's one of these things where, because he's not known as like one of the big names in the industry, but because I think he keeps more in the background, like he doesn't want to go to cons or publish or whatnot. But that guy's an absolute rock star. I mean, he's one of the best exploit writers at the time. He's a phenomenal code reviewer and all around super nice guy.
Yeah, he's pretty tall too.
Yeah. I think he recently got married and had a kid, and I think they bought a house.
Yeah, so it's your original kind of hacker group. Well, I remember he was one of the more kind of prolific people in Netric in terms of putting out.
Yeah, absolutely. Back before we had careers, because his handle is more known than his actual name. So it's SDE, and then S, capital D, and then small EE. And he put out a bunch of really badass exploits. I think the most popular that every script kid in the world used back then was a thing called Sambal, which was a Samba exploit. I can't remember which bug it was. But his was, back then you would write these exploits with these large tables of, this is, this version of Linux with this kernel and then hard-coded offsets. And the idea is you would have these, the longer your offset table, the more reliable exploit, the more the script kids would use it. And so Richard spent like weeks and I think even months collecting all these offsets for everything known to man. So there was every Linux distro in the world, like several versions of FreeBSD, several versions of OpenBSD, Solaris. It has this massive table and all these like extra checks to see if something worked, something didn't work. So the exploit was just super reliable and worked on everything. I think that was his most known exploit. And I know because a bunch of AVs picked it up as well. And I know from time to time I would go look at his exploit, and every time you look at Sambal, like you open up in a browser, your AV will pop up and say, "Oh, your malware so and so." I was like, it's an exploit. Like, yeah, there were others as well. I mean, the website's been down for years now, but on archive.org you can still find a version of it. And there's a number of exploits we had in there, and I think pretty sure Sambal was definitely the most known. The other one, although we never published it, but somehow it leaked, is At some point, there was another Dutch guy found a bug in FreeBSD, which was a memory map ref count overflow, where you could end up with a page that's freed, and then a physical page that's freed that you still have a virtual reference to. And then you could, if you used it right, that would end up in somewhere else. You could then overwrite that page and get code execution on the machine with elevated privileges. And so we did end up writing an exploit for that. One of our guys did. It was another brilliant, super brilliant Dutch guy. It went by the handle PowerPork. And we never published that exploit, but somehow it got out. And I know a bunch of script kiddies went crazy with that. And that exploit was a lot of fun because he spent weeks. He had never done any kernel exploitation, and he got that the BSD internals book and just ripped through the entire chapter on memory management, and he spent weeks and weeks and weeks perfecting the exploit. And because this was a ref count, and certainly back in the day, it would take about 10 hours to complete. So it took him so long to get this thing right and make it reliable, but eventually did. And then anyway, we never published it. Somehow script got their hands on it, so that was kind of famous as well. Even though I should ask him to release his code now, because it would still be historically interesting to see it. I think the thing that was scripts got their hands on was some binary version. I can't even remember what the thing was called. But I think those two, that one and Ensemble, were the most known exploits that came out of Netric.
That actually kind of leads me to my next question. So C code audit, you kind of mentioned this before, people who are really into the kind of C code audit exploitation thing kind of have a tendency to look down their nose at every other form of hacking. It's like it's like the pure math type of snobbery almost, right?
Well, and it's I think a snobbery, and also I think it's a sign of youth, because I no longer hold that view, but certainly when I was younger I did.
Well, as someone who doesn't do as much kind of C code audit stuff, I actually do kind of hold that view. I think it's super impressive because it just seems to require an almost monk-like dedication and focus.
Yeah,
and just you have to get to this higher plane of intensity, where you're just really willing to grind on something for a really long time.
Yeah, there's definitely some of that. One thing that's so weird is, because I've sat in rooms with other people who do code reviews, and a lot of people I see they have a headset on, they're listening to music, and I can't do that when I audit code. I need absolute silence, the least bit of noise or sound. Just throw because you really do need to focus, right? Because you're trying to keep a state machine in your head, and you're 15 functions deep. And I'm trying to remember 7 functions up. Someone validated this one argument in a structure, and I have to remember this to make sure that if this thing is an integer overflow, is it really, or did this thing 7 functions up validate that this thing can't overflow, right? So you're totally right. There is a certain amount of, you really need to sit there and focus and try, and often fail, but you try and keep the whole machine as best as you can in your head to go okay, is this thing a problem or is it not a problem? So there's definitely that.
It almost sounds like grandmaster chess playing, right? You've got to think 15 moves ahead. You have some encyclopedic knowledge of games that have happened in the past. You know, and then
there's definitely, I think there's some of that. But because it sounds like you have to be super smart to do all these things. And I think, obviously, talent and intelligence, that works, or at least that's a benefit. But to me, it's tenacity more than anything else is what gets you there, right? You can't give up. You have to just keep going and kind of hope that you'll run into something at some point. And if you're looking at something really weak, then that's really easy because it's bugs left and right. But if you're looking at something, certainly these days, written by a very, very competent developer, it sometimes is this thing where you're hitting your head against a wall for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you're just looking and looking and looking until you find that one thing, right? So I think tenacity above anything else is what gets you there. And the other thing is, you don't have to be that smart, really, but anything in life, it's an experience game, right? the more you do it, the better you get at it, right? So and it's one of these things where you really can't give up. Like if you only spend if you've never done code reviews and you said, I'm going to go do this, don't expect to find anything the first couple of weeks, right? It's going to take you months to find at least it took me months to find the first thing. I remember a number of years ago, there's a guy who used to work at Microsoft named Neil Clift, which isn't that big of a name in their industry, but if you know him, everybody who knows him respects this guy because he's one of the original fax VMS hackers from the 80s. Like Kevin Mitnick used to steal exploits. Like this guy is ridiculously good. He was telling me that when it took him a whole year, from the moment where he decided I'm going to go look for bugs to finding, and now we're talking late 80s in the VMS, so it was a different world, but still, from the moment he made the decision to finding the first bug, whole year went by, right? So there is that sort of, when you start, it seems like an uphill battle where it's like, oh my God, I'm never going to get there. And again, it's tenacity. Don't give up, right? But once you get over that initial hurdle, things get progressively easier. So as I said, it's an experience game, right? The more you learn, the easier this sort of becomes.
And then it gets faster, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you build up speed. You build up patterns, right? Because a lot of this stuff is sort of intuitive pattern recognition. Like you can go back later and write them out, and then you'll see that everything is a mutation of everything else. But it's all about, if you're reading code, because there's 1,000 different, just you take it in Zeroflow, right? There's 1,000 different ways in Zeroflow can manifest itself, or it would look in a piece of C code, right? And it's up to you to be able to recognize all of these patterns, right? And so it's all about this pattern recognition and building up speed and building up familiarity with a certain code base, and the speed at which you build up this familiarity, right? And so this definitely with experience, everything goes a lot faster. And it's kind of funny you bring this up because I was just 2 or 3 days ago, I was looking at a report for a code review I did probably 12, 13 years ago. And I was looking at this report and the bugs were all valid, but I was like, oh, this is so naive. I could have done things so much better if I knew then what I know now. So there's this sort of continuous loop. I mean, to this very day, almost every time I do a code review, I learn something new, right? It's never complete. There's always an extra pattern. There's always a new way of writing code, or it's that you haven't seen before, or something you have to, because it's not just about, obviously it's about patterns and finding bugs, but it's also because it's about being able to read code and understand what it does fast. So that means, it's hard enough to be able to read your own code, your own style. But one of the things about code review is that you have to be able to be adaptive and be able to, at a fast level, read and understand somebody else's style of coding, right? And C is a relatively easy language compared to, it's a small number of things you can write in C. It's like C++ is a way, way bigger, richer language, right? And C++, that's a whole other thing. But just with languages, quote unquote, simple as C, there are so many different ways to write code. And if you want to be fast at finding bugs, you have to be able to read and understand and adapt to other people's writing style. And I think that above all is new things that I still learn every day, where I was like, oh, I've never seen anybody do it this way. And sometimes something really trivial, but other times it's one of these things where, I have to sit down and spend 3 or 4 hours figuring out what this clever new way of code, what it does, right? And so it's one of these things where you have to remember, if it looks like this, what they're trying to do is this.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd recommend to beginners, people starting out, to maybe exercises they could use to build this set of patterns, or? Yeah.
The best I can do is sort of just recommend what I did, which is, here's the thing, right? I think the greatest thing for code reviewers is open source software. That's where I started, right? Because obviously, you could say, Windows, and you can do reverse engineering, and obviously that's a whole other skill set. But obviously, you can't do a code review of Windows unless you work at Microsoft. Although they've open sourced bits and pieces, but the whole thing is only if you're at Microsoft.
Dude,
So you can't do that. So you have to go look at something that is available. And so open source is just, I mean, I've spent so much time reading the Linux kernel and the FreeBSD kernel, and like the Linux, like I read the SU and the Shadow library, and I read Apache code, and all of these things, they're all out there, right? All you have to do is download them and read it, right? So to me, it's just, as I said, it's an experience game. So you have to just go and do it, right? And to me, open source is a fundamental part of that, because it's out there for free. All you have to do is go download these things, open them up in whatever your favorite IDE is, and just go nuts. Start reading, try to find your entry point, try to figure out what the attack surface is, and look at your data, and then just follow the code all the way through until the function returns, or there's no more data to be parsed, and then you go up, and then you look at the next case and the next case, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
So if the goal is to become familiar with and comfortable with reading as many different coding styles and patterns as possible, do you have any suggestions off the top of your head of code bases that look the most demolition derby, right? That have the most disparate set of styles in it? Because one of the things that I've noticed, at least in some of the more predominant code bases, right, is that they kind of homogenize the styling, right? There's usually one to two people that are really zealot about structure and form, right? And so they enforce a degree of homogeneity because it's easier to read and easier to maintain.
That's a very good question. And obviously, what you said is absolutely true, and it makes sense from like if you're an engineering team, like you would want a style that you could all sort of converge on, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to create a coherent product, right? It's easier if you all adhere to the same style. And I think for that reason, there's probably not that easy to find code bases that have various different, especially not anything that's really big and successful. Because if you have 1,000 different styles all in the same product, it tends to fall apart. That's a very good question. I've never really thought about it. I don't know of any code bases that has like numerous different distinct coding styles. But I think what you could do is you could probably come up with some kind of list and say, here's a bunch of projects that all have the same style, but then you have like 20 different, like, hey, style X, style Y, style Z, and then have different projects under that. Yeah, some kind of index. I think you could do that.
So I think a harder problem might be finding some open source code that Ilja hasn't already looked at. But
it is one of these things where here's what I learned kind of as I was doing code review, is that once you get past that initial hurdle, at least to me, it's a little bit more involved, but it's like I get paid to read a newspaper, basically, right? To me, it's like people wake up in the morning, they read their newspaper, and to me, I wake up in the morning and I read a piece of C code. So it's really, I mean, sometimes it's hard, but most of the time it's just fun. Like I enjoy doing it because it's like you read newspaper, you learn something new. I read a piece of C code and I learn something new.
So I want to ask kind of a similar question at a different level. So like, when you're sitting down and just starting to read a piece of code, you mentioned, I'm kind of wondering what your pregame ritual is, or kind of like what you do per instance. So you mentioned that you need total silence.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
What other kinds of stuff do you do to kind of get in the right headspace?
Oh wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, yes, silence is definitely one of them. I don't know if there's that much pre-ritual to it. I mean, some things are easier than others. I mean, obviously, motivation works. There's certain things where I'm like, I've always wanted to do this, but for whatever reason, never got to it. So that usually makes me extra motivated to look at something. There's other code bases that are just so dreadful and painful to read that, the only way I would ever read it is if people pay me for it. And I mean, it's true, right? Some people just write hideous code, or the style is just so not my thing that I'm just not going to look at it, unless you pay my consulting fee. But yeah, there's not that much ritual to it. It's just a comfortable room. Like I like 21, 22 degrees. A lot of hackers like to work in the dark. I need lighting. The dark doesn't really work for me very well. But beyond that, there isn't much. I mean, a nice quiet room and I guess a big screen works. I can audit on a laptop. I can read code on a laptop. It's fine, although it's a little bit more annoying. I can't, because I'm not that good of a reverse engineer, so I can't look at IDA on a laptop. It doesn't work. Like I need a lot of real estate for that. A lot of real estate is also useful for code review, but I find it less of a priority. Like I can do it on a laptop. Obviously, a big widescreen is easier, but I can do it on like a 13-inch laptop. But besides that, there really isn't all that much to it. I mean, it really is as I said, it's like reading a newspaper. You don't need much, right? I need a keyboard, a screen, a code base, and an editor, right? I mean, in terms of software, though, I mean, there's a couple of things. And actually, recently rewrote this for a internal thing I'm doing, where it's like, how do you navigate large code bases, right?
Yeah.
And this is actually it's better now. When I started 20 years ago or 20 something years ago, it was far less than there is now, right? So if you're talking really large code bases, several million lines of code, what you need or what you want is fast search and cross-referencing, right? Because that's the stuff that gets you, right? If you don't have if you have to grep for everything, that's going to hinder your speed, right? If you grep for a string through the Linux kernel, it takes like 20 minutes for your grep to complete, right? That's really painful. And so that's all we used to only just kind of have grep and maybe C tags. And so C tags is one which I could recommend. And then around that you have cscope, which is good. But then I guess now already a decade and change ago, Google had this Google Code Search web app thing, which they decommissioned, but they open sourced the Code Search engine. And that thing is a lifesaver. It builds up, so you point it at a large code base, builds up an index. Once it has the index, you can do regex searches over the index. And even if you have a code base that's like multiple million lines of code, it like completes within a second, right? So you can look up anything in a really large code base instantly. So that is really, really useful. And then you can like build code around it or something that does similar, that has a full interface. So like Elixir or Elixir or OpenGrok, although OpenGrok isn't really my favorite, but I don't like to use OpenGrok for code review because I don't like the UI. It's an engineering, I guess. I'm not a big fan of Java either, but OpenGrok does work. OpenGrok in general does work. It's not my favorite UI. The tool I use most of the time, and obviously Ben knows this, is a really old tool called Source Inside. And I learned of this before I did Source Inside. I used Nano and cscope for auditing, and then I set foot at Microsoft in early 2006, and they showed me this tool called Source Inside, and it does bitchin' cross-referencing for code bases it doesn't have makefiles for. On occasion, it gets things wrong, but most of the time it gets things right, and it's kind of fuzzy. Like, it doesn't need to understand your build environment. It just makes a guess, and most of the time it guesses right.
Yeah, I really like Source Insight because it was one of the first programs where you don't need to be able to build it, but you could right click on something and do like find all references.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And it does it fast. It does right once it builds its index to find references, because you can do find references without an index, but it's dog slow, right? If you're talking a large code base, you're talking minutes, tens of minutes. But Source Insight, just like a code search, builds its index, and you say reference search, and you're looking at a code base that's 2 million lines of code, and you just instantly get the whole list.
But I knew you were still using Source Insight because in your Source Insight does really weird stuff with fonts. Like it makes some things it makes some things bigger and blue. On the same line, so it like blows up certain important keywords. And when in your last talk from last October, all your source screenshots had that distinctive Source Insight.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's some other tools. So I think for the longest time there really wasn't much a big enough market for anybody to build a tool for code review. Because Source Insight was not built for code review. It was built as an IDE. And in fact, I don't know if it's still the case, but I know back at Windows, Microsoft in 2006 people actually use Source Inside to write pieces of Windows. I know especially the server org was really big on using Source Inside. It just happened, the way it was written, it just happened to work really well for code review as well. And there wasn't much else out there. I think the only competitor is Understand, which, again, it comes down to UIs. Understand and Source Inside aren't quite the same, but they try to do similar things. And to me, the UI for I prefer Source Inside over Understand simply because that's what I'm used to it. And the other thing is that Understand is like, it's got like more knobs and buttons and like stuff I don't need. I just want to read code. Right. The flip side of that is that Understand is way more powerful when it comes to extensibility and modules and scripting. Source Inside has its own language, which is okay. It's not overly powerful, and honestly, I don't really use it that much. I think I used it once to like build like a bookmark functionality. I mean, technically, because it does give you some kind of tree, so you could try to do some static analysis with it, but I never really looked that much into it. Whereas I don't Understand is as a really powerful engine with a bunch of callbacks for different languages where you can do all sorts of cool things with it. But honestly, if I'm doing a manual code review, I don't need all those bells and whistles. I need an easy UI. I need cross-referencing. I need search, and I want it to be fast. And then, just an easy way to navigate these things. And then I guess on occasion, Source Inside does also give you these. If it can, it tries to figure out these trees of this function calls to this one. That on occasion is useful as well. But it's simple enough. It just gets the job done. I know there's like recently there's some more tools. I've tried some of them. It never reached the usefulness level of Source Inside, where it's just that magical mix of things where they just happen. And it wasn't designed for code review. They happened to stumble upon this magic combination of things. I know I recently did some Visual Studio VS Code stuff, which was okay, but again, didn't feel as good as Source Inside. On occasion, I use other tools. It's gotten a lot easier with Source Inside 4, but up until Source Inside 3, it's like if it didn't support a certain language, technically you could implement a template for it, but it's hit or miss. So if I had to audit something that wasn't in the list of that Source Inside understands, I would go to something else. I did an audit, a code audit of some Fortran code a while ago, and that I needed I needed a different tool for that. It doesn't understand PHP. There's a few other languages where it just doesn't understand it, and so you have to go with something else. But whenever I can go whenever I do hit a language that Source Inside understands, like C, that tends to be my go-to tool.
I like PHP Storm for PHP, by the way, but there's also RIPS. There's a really old static analysis tool for PHP. Which is
you told me about that. Yeah.
Oh my God, that thing! It doesn't work so well on the the new class PHP, but there's a commercial product apparently they made. But the old open source version of RIPS, I've just I've torn through some serious bugs with that. It actually does taint tracking. So it has a list of like known bad syncs, and can automatically find your way from the source, like the attack surface, to a vulnerable sync in code.
That's awesome.
And the whole thing's open source. It's one of the best open source static analysis tools of all time.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about that, and that was very mind blowing. Because one of the things that was about RIPS is that not only does it do that, but it actually documents all of the things it looks for very well. And it's not just like one or two simple things. There's a long list of things this thing looks for, right? Whoever made that thing knew very well what he was doing, and a very deep understanding of PHP bugs, and then spend a lot of time implementing it.
Yeah, no doubt. Because it's not PHP. There isn't really like a formal grammar for it. So the whole thing is just a rat's nest of handcrafted rules.
Yeah.
But you don't see taint tracking in it's still not even very common. Even in like commercial static analysis tools, most of them don't do taint tracking as well as RIPS did.
And those that do, it's not like it takes effort. Because it really does come down to like getting your build environment right and being able, because it's like you can look for a receive, but you have no idea if that receive is interesting or not. So it's very hard to do any kind of taint tracking in a piece of C code unless your tools have a very intuitive understanding of how this thing works in its entirety, like how the build works, and where you say, this is a taxer. Like this receive is from a network thing that is interesting. So unless you, and this, if you're doing commercial tools and you're selling this to a product team, and you have a team behind a tool who can fine tune these things, it does actually work. It's just the process of getting there and setting it up and configuring it is, you need a commercial team of people to like set this up for their code base. Anything short of that, it usually isn't worth the effort. Whereas for RIPS and PHP, it's like well, first of all, I think it's a little bit easier because even though you can do pretty general programming PHP if you want to, in general, PHP is meant for a specific thing, which is web applications, right? And so it's a little bit easier, I think, for it to do taint tracking simply because of that, and especially if you use it for web applications. I don't know if it would work as well if you just take some kind of general app you made in PHP for something absolutely not web related. I don't know if it would work as well on that. But then again, most people don't, right?
Taint tracking in C is a really hard problem. It's a much harder problem than PHP because it's not as constrained. Like exactly. C is basically it's a thin layer over assembly code.
Yep, it's portable assembly essentially.
It's really difficult to keep track of all of the memory you might have touched.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's macros.
Oh god, the preprocessor macros. We were talking about like, what's a nasty piece of open source to look at. I almost chimed in and said, have you ever looked at the Perl interpreter?
That's a good one. That's a really good one.
Oh boy.
The Perl interpreter is actually, if you spend enough time on it, there is actually structure to it. There's structure to madness. There's a document somewhere of like it's 80 pages that describes all the little things about you need to know if you're going to read or write Perl code. And if you understand all of it intuitively, it actually makes sense. But to mere mortals, I mean, that's years of development right there. But to mere mortals, you look at Perl code and you're like, what is this horrible nightmare? PP, like two capital P, small v, capital H. It's like, what? Like these name prefixes are ridiculous, right? It's a nightmare. On occasion, I've read some Perl to C interfaces, so I know exactly just how shitty this looks. What's the other one? Procmail. Procmail is one of the worst things I've ever looked at. Procmail was so bad. So there's a tool called indent in Unix, which you tend to throw, if you have badly formatted C code, you throw indent over it, and then it looks better. I think it's fixed now, but back in the day, if you did an indent of Procmail, indent would segfault. Like that's serious, I'm not joking. Like that's how bad Procmail was.
Amazing.
Your code formatter chooses death over formatting.
Exactly. Yes.
That's pretty bad.
That in and of itself is impressive. Now I want to build a completely different index, which is just the index of code bases that make pretty printing
yes
fail.
I would love to see that, because I'm sure there's more really shitty code bases that will crash
I wonder
code
if that was that crash exploitable.
I don't remember. It just bugged the fuck out of me.
That'll teach you to indent this.
That'll teach you to try to read my code.
Exactly. Maybe it was not on purpose.
Well, I was kind of expecting a shout out to Diet Coke in there somewhere.
Well, I mean, I do drink a lot of Coke. This is true.
We like there have been people that have attempted to estimate how much Diet Coke it takes per bug.
Well, it's actually not Diet Coke, so I drink normal Coca-Cola most of the time. But it's true. When you walk through my office at Microsoft, back when I was there would usually be these huge stacks of empty bottles. And I should cut down on the Coca-Cola because I know it's not very healthy for me. And both my doctor and my dentist told me this too. But I don't know. It's one of my many sins, I guess.
Yeah, well, I was drinking a lot of Red Bull at one point until my body told me that I had to stop.
Yeah, Red Bull. That's the one that gets to me. I can't drink that much Red Bull because my stomach gets really upset.
Oh yeah. I feel I get like it's too much caffeine. Yeah, like a fair and steady dose of caffeine I think is pretty helpful, but it you can't kind of go up too much.
Yeah, and it's one of these things. I noticed this too. And even with Coca-Cola, it doesn't affect me that much. But certainly when I drink coffee, it does. In my 20s, I could drink as much of this stuff and I wouldn't feel it. Now, if I drink too much caffeine, like you get that really like kind of like jittery, like where and you just don't really feel well. Yeah, trying to manage the level of caffeine where it works, but you don't go crazy. It is certainly, I'm certainly feeling it now. 10 years ago, I could drink as much of it as I wanted, and it wouldn't faze me. But now it is all about trying to find that balance.
So total tangent, but apparently, so one of my younger friends kind of turned me onto this. You can get this green tea extract. It's like L-theanine.
Okay.
Which apparently you can get it in pill form, and apparently it is in most plants that have caffeine in them naturally. They also have this chemical.
Okay.
And it kind of counteracts the jittery aspect of caffeine.
Interesting.
So it's like if you drink green tea, there are equal parts of caffeine and this other chemical like L-theanine that kind of counteract the jitteriness. So you can just drink a ton of green tea without getting too heart attacky.
Oh, that's good to know. I'm not a big tea drinker, but maybe I should look into this.
Well, kind of the new hotness. This is actually been pretty trendy with people in the pandemic too, because it's a pill you can take that kind of makes you feel mellow without feeling sleepy.
Okay.
Right. So they've been selling a ton of this, but apparently, if you take that along with caffeine, that kind of helps put you in a more kind of balanced state. My personal favorite is I think the reason a lot of hacker types like yerba mate is that, anecdotally speaking, people would say, oh, it gives you less jitters. But I guess chemically speaking, it's because mate has a lot more of this L-theanine in it along with the caffeine than coffee does. So it might be more a matter of just balancing the one chemical with the other.
Yeah, could be.
But
it's interesting. Yeah, I never really got into Club Mate. I tried it a few times. And
Blasphemy.
I know, but it's one of these things because I know what their slogan is, and like you get used to it. But I already have enough vices. I don't need to get used to it,
right.
And so I didn't particularly enjoy the taste. So I think I tried it 3 or 4 times, and I was like, it's not for me.
If I stop drinking it for a while and I taste it again, you're like, oh, I got to get used to it again, I guess. Well, with that, let's take a bit of a break, and we'll return with Ilja van Sprundel after these non-commercial announcements. Hey, this is Ben from Cymbal Crash. While we're taking a quick break from our conversation with Ilja, I have a special announcement from the guest of our next episode, Noid, longtime DEF CON organizer and goon, and co-founder of the Layer 1 conference. The Layer 1 call for papers has been extended until April 15th, so you have a couple more days to submit your talk on exploit development, reverse engineering, crypto, forensics, hardware or physical security, mobile malware, or legal issues. To submit a talk for Layer 1, go to layer1.org. That's the number spelled out, ONE, layer1.org/call-4-papers. I'd also like to remind you that we do a minimal amount of community engagement via Twitter. Please give us a pity follow at SymbolCrash1. That's SYMBOL Crash and the number 1. Check out our blog for interesting articles, the links associated with each episode, and all previous episodes at symbolcrash.com. Also check out our YouTube channel at youtube.com/symbolcrash. Finally, we want to hear from you. Suggest a guest for a future episode, let us know how you like the show, or tell us the weirdest, craziest, funniest thing you've seen on an engagement. Anonymize, please, by sending an email to podcast@symbolcrash.com or leaving a message on the hacker hotline at 206-486-6272. That's 206-GUN-NARC. And now, back to our interview with Ilja. And we're back with Ilja van Sprundel. I want to spend the second half here going over some of your talks, some of your many talks. But before that, there is one. So there are several kind of epic Ilja stories that I've heard over the years. But there's one in particular. I'm not going to say this is the most epic, but this is one that stands out. So there is one of the folk tales of Ilja that goes around is the Minix exploit.
Yeah, this goes back to our Netric days. So we're talking early 2000s, and I think I can now talk about it because I think the statute of limitations have long run out. But basically, yeah, I was sitting down with some of my Netric buddies. This was right before the second pH neutral, so you can count back. I think it's like 2003 or something. And I was just reading, some random piece of code, and for whatever reason, I stumbled on at this phase where I was like, oh, let's go look at some Minix stuff, and I run into this bug in the and we're talking early 2000s, so most Unixes, including Minix, had this thing where they still turned on every service known to man because that was the cool thing to do. And so the Minix by default, this was before Minix 3, so we're still talking old school Minix 2. And so it had its own FTP daemon and it was on by default. I don't think anonymous login was on by default, but you could tell it into it, and then if you had the right creds, you could, do FTP stuff. But I noticed, so FTP has a fairly well-known and standardized commands, but there's one command, the site command, which allows you to implement whatever you want. And so Minix had this weird thing where they had a command called sitecrc, and that basically gave you a crc32 of whatever file you wanted. And I noticed that the sitecrc command, I noticed two things about it. One is it didn't do an authentication check, so you could do sitecrc on any file before logging in, and it would give you the crc32 back, which obviously, technically that was a mistake, but it wasn't very useful. But the other thing I noticed is the way they did crc is they took the file name and they did system crc32 and then sprintf in the file name. So you had this trivial command line injection. So you do site crc32 semicolon whatever commands, and it would execute. And because the FTP daemon ran as root, it would execute as root. And it was pre-auth, right? So we had pre-auth remote root. And so that was really interesting. And so me and my buddy, we basically scanned the entire internet, and we found that there were 3 Minix machines on the whole internet, at least that run the FTP daemon, but that was probably all of them. And so, yeah, in one night we rooted all 3 Minix servers on the internet. And we owned every Minix box on the internet at the time. And then later, someone did discover it, and then a patch was made, and then an advisory was released. So the funny thing about the advisory is that a little while after that, the first version of Minix 3 did come out, and they had forgotten to apply the FTP patch to the Minix 3 version because it was forked from an older version. And so they had to reissue the advisory for Minix 3 because they had forked the wrong version of the FTP daemon.
So for people who aren't familiar with Minix, as I recall, Minix was kind of the first open source Unix. I think it was written by Andrew Tannenbaum.
Yes.
Who is I know he was eventually a professor at some university in the Netherlands, I want to say. Yep. But he's mostly known by every computer science student as the guy that writes the operating system textbook that everyone on the planet is required to read.
Absolutely. And there's a good reason for that. That textbook is just legendary, right?
Yeah.
And the really cool thing is he has retired. I think he retired a few years ago. But that is, to me, that's like the textbook on OSs, right? There's a lot of these textbooks on operating systems, but a lot of them are quite boring. And a lot of them spend way too much time on scheduling, which is, in my opinion, the most boring thing about an OS. Obviously, it's important, but from a strictly point of view of like playing out with OSs, scheduling is boring. And so, what I love about Tannenbaum's book is that I think the latest one is like the 9th revision or something. It really updates this shit. And if you look at the last version of this stuff, it talks about I think it's Windows 10, It talks about hypervisors. It talks about all sorts of modern stuff. It has a chapter on security where they say, talk about buffer overflow, stuff like that. It's very practical. It's super hands-on, as far as hands-on can be for a general OS book. To me, that is like the gold standard for if you have a university degree, you should have read that book, or you should have been taught from that book, and you should have read it cover to cover, because that gives you an enormously good just general background on OS internals.
Well, so at some point, I won't guess at the year, but like late 80s, early 90s, I'm guessing was the first version of Minix. Yeah. So he writes his own Unix-like operating system and makes it open source, and that is what Linus Torvalds went off of when he wrote the first version of Linux. So I imagine that the reason there were only 3 versions of Minix running is that it was just people who like there's always one guy who's like, I'm going to still run a PDP 10 and connect it to the internet, right? Like, so you got to imagine that like whoever was running Minix at that time was just doing it as some kind of academic old school geek flex, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think I seem to remember one of the 3 was I think maybe Tannenbaum's machine himself. It was a Minix machine at the University of Amsterdam where he worked. So presumably it was something in his group or something. But the other 2 was has to be some random guy who's like, oh, let me go run Minix. What is this thing? Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're right. I think Minix. I think my understanding, if memory recalls, I think Minix started in like '87 or something. And I mean, stunningly, I mean, Tannenbaum, I mean, such a smart dude, man. He wrote it in a couple of months. One guy from scratch. Yeah. I mean, that is impressive. And because most Unix at the time were monolithic, he decided, screw it, I'm going to make a microkernel Unix, which at the time certainly was not the standard.
Have you ever actually, so you guys are in kind of a similar part of the world, and I know later in his career he got more into kind of security stuff with some of his students, because he later published that he was the first one to publish something that pointed out that you could do SQL injection through RFID tags, which had occurred to some people before, but he was the first person to publish something on it. And I was like, is that the operating system textbook guy? Like, wow, he's branching out, Yeah,
no, he definitely. So here's the fun thing about Minix is there are some modern operating systems that are mildly inspired by Minix. I did a little bit of, this was some internal stuff at IOActive, but I did a little bit of comparison between how does Minix stack up against sort of Minix lookalikes. And so as part of that, I kind of dug into some of the history and sort of, what Andy Tannenbaum has done. And I looked up some of his recent presentations. And he clearly, just looking at his OS book, the man clearly has a deep understanding of not just operating systems, but also computer security. Especially if you look at Minix, they did some fairly interesting security work there. I mean, there's a bunch of shortcomings there too, and I think that's mostly because the amount of review it gets is very limited. But like one of the things they never really completed it, but and we can talk about some of this later. But one of the things he wanted to do in Minix 3 was add a bunch of DMA protection, because Minix is a microkernel, everything runs as almost everything runs as userland. The kernel is like maybe less than 10,000 lines of code, and it's got like 12 system calls or something. Actually, I think it's 60 system calls, but there's 13 that are like quote unquote unprivileged or basic is what they call them. And so one of the things they have is they have this floppy service that is not in the TCP, so it runs in userland. It doesn't run as root. But if you talk to the floppy drive can DMA, even though it's limited to 24 bits. The idea is that if you go to the floppy and say, hey, DMA into this physical page that somebody else owns, then you can basically escalate from the floppy service to the kernel, right? And so Tannenbaum was very well aware of it. And in fact, there are comments saying this is a problem, we should fix this. And in one of his later presentations, he said, we want to do this. And there was some, because Minix now, he retired and pretty much died out. But there was a rudimentary, I think AMD Sev or AMD Dev implementation, but even that had lots of comments saying this is incomplete, needs lots of work. But it was remarkable to see his in-depth experience with security, certainly with regards to Minix.
And that actually is a good that's a good segue into the next bit here, where I wanted to talk about at least some of your talks. So I just kind of made some notes out of just the list of talks you've given at CCC events. I mean, when I was looking into this, I found you were giving some kind of talks even back in the Netric days. There's on archive.org, there's one of your old presentations. So in the last 10 years or so, you in chronological order, you did one on hacking smartphones, another one on iOS app security. Then there was one on the X Windows security, which is one I saw in person.
Yeah, that was fun.
I saw that in person, and that is one of my favorite talks of yours of all time. And then there was Windows drivers, the attack surface of Windows drivers. Then there was BSD kernel vulnerabilities. And then the MEMSAD, which was just about the difficulties in clearing memory. And then you went on a swing through bootloaders. And there's the boot to root talk.
True.
And then this last season, you've been focused on the IOMMU.
Yeah, that's true. And actually, the IOMMU stuff actually came out of the bootloader stuff. I don't know if you saw the slides for the bootloader stuff, but we have one slide on DMA and IOMMU, and we basically say, we can't cover it here. It's way too much to talk about.
Yeah.
And then, because I did that one with a colleague, Joseph Tartaro, and I did the DMA one as well, or the IOMMU one with Joseph as well. And it's because it's really, to us, it's an extension to the bootloader talk, where it's like, it's this one thing we didn't really get to talk about because there's too much to talk about.
So it seems like you will spend one or 2 years in a particular space, and then kind of move to a different space.
Yeah, more or less. I mean, it wasn't planned, but it sort of evolved into that. Where a year is, for me, seems more or less the right amount of time to. Because the thing is, like, you do this stuff, and it really doesn't take a year. Like, you're a few months in, and then you can go like, okay, I have enough material here to make a presentation. So you slowly morph that into a presentation, and now conference season comes around, and you start submitting stuff. And then, it usually ends up getting selected at 2 or 3 conferences that are usually a month, 2 months, 3 months apart. And so what happens is you do V1 your first, which is your material you had before, which you morphed to a slide deck. And then you do that at that one, and then you learn certain things from that presentation, and you get feedback from the audience, and you do some more research, and then you get like a V2, that's the second conference, and then sometimes there's a V3, and by the time you're at V3, you're like, okay, you know what, this is enough. I'm done with this. I don't need to milk this. Because I know there are people that have a presentation and they present it at like 10 different conferences, right? I think 3 is enough. I mean, you can always add more stuff to it, but it's usually this evolution, and then usually after 2 or 3, I'm like, okay, let me go find, like, I'm kind of done with this. Let me go and try to find something else. And that's usually, it'll be something hits me, or as was this the case, it was literally just, there's this one thing that we couldn't do in the bootloader stuff because it just didn't, there was too much of it. Let's go do that now. And sometimes it's totally random. And it's one of these things where I have because every so often, like, you get an idea and then you never get to it. So a couple of years ago, I started keeping a list of all these ideas I had that I never get to. And I even stopped updating the list now. But it just keeps growing because there's too much stuff every time. Like, I'll see a conference comes around, and usually when I go to conferences, I don't see that many talks because I tend to go for the people. But what happens is usually the conferences will publish the papers and slides several weeks after. And what happens is I'll take a weekend and run through everything. Like, I'll download everything. I mean, unless there's stuff that's not interesting, but most of the things I try to run through just to try to keep up, right? Because the more I see these things, the more I learn, the more I realize that I know very, very little, right? Our space has exploded. It's so crazy, right? But you'll see these things, and like you'll have conversations with people, and you'll go like, I wonder how this works, or what about this, or what if you do this, then what happens, right? And so there's this endless amount of ideas, and it's just for whatever reason something sticks at some point, and you start playing around with it, and some things pay off really fast, and other things it's like, okay, I've played with this, and then it didn't really get very like I have a thing where I've been playing around and for years and years and years with like instruction set fuzzing, and like I have some I've hit some kernel bugs with it, I've hit some hypervisor bugs with it, but it's not quite ready yet. Like there's more there to be done before I could, and maybe it'll never happen. Maybe that's a presentation coming in the future. There's a library Intel put out, I think called XCD or something, which is an instruction set encoder. That I recently started playing with, which may end up making things a lot easier. Anyway, that's just one idea where it's like, okay, this is taken as a multi-year thing, may never happen, may come to fruition at some point. And then other things, it's like, I spent 3 weeks hacking on this stuff, and it's like, this is it. This is my next research thing, right? So there's no real process to it. It's just these things. It tends to be this evolutionary process where after about a year, I'm done with something, and then something else usually comes along. And then, if that develops into enough stuff, then I can go out and like present it somewhere. And to me, I think that's important because I know, like, there's lots of different ways and reasons that people present, but to me, the number one reason is to share stuff, right? Like, hey, I found this cool thing. It may be interesting to others. Let me go present it somewhere. The other is that you get a free plane ticket and a free hotel, and you get to hang around with a bunch of your friends, and someone else is paying for it. So those two things combined is why I very much enjoy speaking at security conferences.
Yeah. So I've given a little bit of thought to what your meta process might be. And it seems like maybe all of your talks, well, I can't say all of your talks because I honestly haven't seen all 50 or 60 talks or whatever the count is, but it seems like your general process is well, first of all, you have to pick on something that there's open source code for that wasn't paid work, right? So it's not covered by an NDA.
Yes.
So you have to do this on your own time. You pick out something for which there's source where you can go find bugs that you're allowed to talk about.
Yep.
And it seems like you're usually looking for a new trust boundary, right? Like something that may not have been considered a trust boundary before, but because of the shifting sands, so to speak, it's a new trust boundary, open source code, and then you just sit down and grind out like 100 bugs or something, and then most of your talks are like, we've identified, and then you try to up-level patterns from that. So then your talks are so amazing because you're like, here are the abstract patterns we've identified, and then here's just a bazillion bugs we found in specific places, and you actually, pop up code on the screen, like, here's the bug, here's another bug, here's another bug.
I think you're pretty much spot on. The first thing you hit on is totally right, is that almost most things I talk about is open source stuff, and it's because of non-disclosure agreements, right? I mean, I could talk about a bunch of closed source stuff, but then I'd violate an NDA. Even if I didn't violate an NDA, I'd piss off a customer, right? So I try to shift toward open source stuff because it's just so much easier to find stuff there where I'm not going to piss off a customer. And the other thing is when you do binary stuff, it tends to be, and as I said before, like I can play around with IDI and I can read assembly, but I wouldn't say I'm very good at it. So if I were to look for binary stuff, it would take me a lot more effort than if I had to go, read a bunch of C code or whatever code. And the other thing that's right is that I try to look for, it's interesting, attack surface, something new, but I guess attack surface is a good way to describe it. Because usually what you see is like, you'll see something new happen and then that's quote unquote relatively easy if you look at something no one's ever looked before. Whereas if you look at something that everyone's done before, and it's like if you look at recent mitigations, right? This is one of the reasons why I haven't written an exploit since I guess we worked together last time, a decade ago or something. I haven't really written many exploits because it's gotten a lot more involved, right? I mean, I could quit my job and become an exploit writer and ramp up on that, but it's a field where it's just like it's gotten relatively mature, where the technologies are pretty good. I mean, the GRSec guys were definitely laid the groundwork here. I mean, there was some stuff done before, but they really took it to a new level. And then people build upon that and build upon that. And so if you write let's say if you're writing a modern exploit for a browser and then escalate to the kernel and so on, that's a long, painstaking process. And at the end of the day, it's like, is it even worth presenting? And then if you do go present, you get so deep into things that are you can't grasp from sitting in a chair. You would have to go back home and spend weeks reproducing this process. And so I've tried to stay away from that and instead try to go for, okay, what's the stuff someone hasn't looked at before, where I know I can make, in a reasonable amount of time, I can make a good amount of progress, and I can present it, and it'll be something that people can wrap their heads around when they're sitting there, and they don't have to go back home and spend weeks like opening up a debugger and oh, this is why this thing doesn't, So that's sort of been my game, I guess. And none of this was planned. It's just kind of evolved that way.
I guess I really would recommend that people check out the X security talk, because that one really was pretty mind blowing. And I guess what the quote unquote new attack surface there was people were kind of starting to think that Linux might be usable as a multi-user operating system. And then you just kind of came in and you were like, yeah, if you have X installed, it's kind of not. Like, because you can just you can escalate here, you can escalate here, you can escalate here. Like, we found a bazillion bugs.
Yep.
And then my favorite part of that, as I recall, is towards the end, you're like, and then we tried to report this, to the project managers, and they basically were like, no, won't fix. Like, what kind of maniac would assume that Linux is safe as a multi-user system, right? And then I was, I always love those talks, because as someone who does PenTest, that tells me, hey, it's like bugs with canned exploits that no one will ever fix. Like, that's something I make a special note about, right?
Yeah, no, that X11 talk was, dude, you hit on all the right points there. So the X11 talk was really fun because, so I've been using Linux since about the late 90s, and since forever, I've been, I mean, like, you read about the X protocol, but I've always wanted to dig in it and be like, what's this thing really like? How does this stuff really work internally? And just never really got around to it. And then 1 week, I came back right from the CC Congress. I don't remember when. It's probably, I don't know, it must have been a decade, 2011 or something maybe. I don't know exactly when. Came home from the CC Congress, and I had a week off before I had to get back to work. And I started off looking at the client side of X. And the client side of X is actually, I mean, it's engineered in the 1980s, but, and obviously it has historical artifacts, but in terms of understanding the code and the layout of it is actually, the APIs are very easy to understand. And it took me about a week to go, okay, here's all of the network attack surface. Here's where it takes all data. Here's where 80 bugs are, right? Within a week, I was able to flush out all the low-level bugs. And then I was like, okay, well, and it evolved, right? So it started off with 10 years of like, I wonder how this works. And I finally sit down and do it. The first half of it took me a week, and that was just, and I reported that. And so the X11 guys were actually really good about that. And they said, okay, they understood it. They understood all of it. There was no hand-holding. There was can't remember, but there was a guy at Sun, he now works, I get an Oracle, who was just amazing. He just instantly understood all these bugs. Usually when you report a bug, people get very because it's like you're insulting their kid, right? So they get very defensive. This guy was like, no. Like, I understand all these bugs. Let me go fix them. And then within 3 months, they fixed all 80 bugs, which was remarkable. But one part of that, it wasn't, I didn't just look at X. I looked at some of the stuff on top of X. So like GNOME and Qt and KDE. And KDE is really sort of built on top of Qt. And it was Qt. I looked at Qt, and I found a number of bugs in Qt where it's like, if you have an SUID binary that's a Qt binary, things go really, really wrong. So as you mentioned, I report this to Qt, and the Qt folks go back and go like, no, hold on, no. You should never, ever have SUID Qt binaries. And the reason why is because Qt has code execution by default. You give it a template and it runs code inside the template. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Here's the list of KDE applications that are SUID by default, right? One of them was KPP. There's KSU. There's a bunch of others. Now they do priv stepping, and so you don't get straight up root, but they have like a socket, certain things. So like if you don't KPP, for example, you can rewrite what's etc hosts, and so you can mess with DNS, which is obviously that buys you a bunch of things. And so I mailed back to these guys and I'm like, hold on, here's KPP, it has an SUID bit, and then they say, oh, well, hold on, here's the KPP website, and it says that you shouldn't have it on. And I'm like, actually, if you read right below what you point me to, it says, the KPP engineering team has spent significant resources trying to secure this thing. We consider it safe to turn on the SUID bit. It is built for that. And you broke their promise, right? And so there was a bit of back and forth with the QT team. And initially they were like, no, screw you. You don't know what you're talking about. And then I kind of publicly shamed them. And then they fixed it, right? So we may not be on each other's Christmas card list, but they did fix the bug. And I think overall that improved the security somewhat for KDE and Qt apps that are use SUID bit. So there was that, and then so after that week of the client stuff, and this took me another year or so of like getting into it. I moved to like the server stuff, and that's the server is a behemoth, and it took a lot more time. There's a lot more code there, and it's a lot more like decentralized and not as trivial to architect it and read as the client. And so it was several months of me reading the server code and looking at all of these 35 different extensions. And then out came another 120 bugs or so. And so I reported those to the guys from Xorg. And that took them a bit longer to fix. I think they spent almost a year fixing that, which I think is a testament to how much more complex the server is versus the client. And the server is one of these things where it has massively evolved over time, where like you think of X11 as the same thing that X11 was in the 1980s, except X11 today is nothing like, I mean, it can still do what X11 did in 1988 or 89, which is network transparent, but it isn't network transparent by default. If you have it locally, it uses like shared memory, and it has kernel drivers, and it talks directly to your GPU through this DRM infrastructure and all these weird things that wouldn't work over the network, right? And so that's one of these things where there's a really good, I think 2013 presentation by a guy named Daniel Stone, I think. I can look up his name about X11, where he says, X is no longer network transparent. It's network capable, right? And that's so true. Like X11 of today is nothing like X11 of 30 years ago, even though it can still do what X11 did 30 years ago. And so it's grown as this huge behemoth. And so that took a bit longer to fix and wrap my head around. And then I'd done initial presentation of just the client stuff. And then I took the client and the server stuff together and said, okay, this is a really good presentation here. Let me go present this at the Congress. And also the thing about a presentation like that at the Congress works really well because it's a lot of Linux nerds and a lot of open source nerds. And so, and they all have the same thing that I had, which is like, we all use X11, but none of us have a fucking clue how this shit works. And so that was really well, right? So, and that was really well received by the CCC. And with the exception of the QT guys, the X11 guys were, and I keep forgetting this guy's name, but they were phenomenal in fixing these things and understanding them. It's rare when you report bugs that it's that welcomed and that the people are that informed, that intuitive, and are like in this on the same page as you. Because a lot of times when you report bugs, either commercially or as an open source thing, there's a bit of that sort of like almost hostility, like adversarial thing. Mm-hmm. Ideally, you don't want it to be there, but it ends up, and no one's looking for it, but it just kind of happens because like you're attacking their program, like you're saying their kid is ugly, right? Not so with X11, and one of them is because I think the X11 developers aren't the guys that started stuff in the 80s. Like they know what their legacy stuff is. They know where the bodies are buried. So when a bug comes in, they go like, we know exactly what you're talking about. Let us go fix this shit. So that was X11 stuff. That was a blast. I really enjoyed doing that. And I actually never completed it. I think the client stuff was fairly complete. The server stuff, I just, at some point, I gave up. So there's this, one of the extensions in X11 is something called GLX, which are the GL extensions for X. And they weren't even written by the X folks. So that was SGI wrote it and then just donated it to the X folks. And it's 40,000 lines of, I think the quote was 40,000 lines of sheer terror. The code is not, you can't understand it. It's virtually impossible. I mean, talk about terrible code bases. And that was such a demotivator that I halfway through, and I think of the 120, like half of them were just GLX. And I kind of stopped there because I was like, I don't want to read more of this code unless you pay me for it. And so, and the X folks were just like, we totally understand. They're like, yeah, that code, none of us understand it. No one wants to touch it. And so that my big win, I think, on the X11 side is basically, at least something that I inspired, I think, is that after that submission, they fixed all the bugs, including all those like 50 or 60 bugs in GLX, but they added a switch to X11, and they changed the behavior. So X11 by default, after I submitted those bugs, does not load a GLX extension, and you have to have an explicit switch to start X to say, hey, I really want to use GLX, because the attack surface is just so gross. But yeah,
have you looked at Wayland?
Yeah. So I have not. It's one of these things. So the thing I mentioned earlier, that talk about Daniel Stone, is actually about Wayland, but the whole thing is about the history of Wayland, and then that goes back to here's how much X11 sucks, and so the whole hour is about how much X11 sucks, and then Wayland is all the things that X11 isn't. So I have not yet looked at Wayland, but it's on my list. It's like one of the things at some point I would love to. Wayland adoption has taken longer than I figured it would. Clearly, it's a little bit harder to integrate it right, and I know it has some X11 emulation, and I kind of still expect Wayland to become the standard in the future. I haven't looked at it in depth, but just from the sheer look of it, by default, it looks like security-wise it works better than X11. For example, the compositor doesn't run as root by default, right? So that's a start. Beyond that, I know there's some message passing back and forth, but I haven't looked too deep into any of the Wayland stuff. It's interesting. I want to look at it. Maybe someday I will.
Well, speaking of things that have taken longer to adopt successfully than you might have at first thought, we can change gears to your more recent topic, which is the IOMMU and maybe the bootloader thing. So your most recent talk, given virtually back in October, was things not to do in the IOMMU.
Yeah, that was so that was fun. And so as you mentioned, so that came out of. So maybe let me talk about the bootloader stuff first, because this literally came out of it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So both presentations I did with a coworker named Joseph Startaro, and the bootloader stuff came out of this, right? So basically, we had done a bunch of bootloader stuff at IOA for various customers, and it used to be that on rare occasions we'd get one, but in last couple of years with all these IoT and smart devices and whatnot, there's this massive everything these days has to have secure boot and a secure bootloader. And so the last couple of years, it's just nonstop engagements for bootloader reviews. And so I was in Silicon Valley with my buddy Joseph, and we were doing something for some bootloader stuff. And after work, we went on the Caltrain to go see a Giants game. And Joe and I were talking, and we're like, look, we're not even talking about presentation. We're just like, we should somehow standardize our process for the bootloader stuff, because really, they're all more or less the same. Here's here's the entire attack surface for like bootloaders, right? And we're on the train, like we're writing this down on a piece of paper, and like we come up with this list, which is basically the outline we have for a bootloader presentation. And I'm looking at the stuff, and I'm looking at our list of everything that's a bootloader in terms of attack surface, and then like you fill in the blanks. But I look at it and I'm like, well, that's a presentation right there. I don't think anybody's ever looked. I mean, there are some bootloader presentations that came before us, but it's all about the root of trust and the chain of trust. which is very interesting. On a design level, obviously you got to get, if you don't get that right, you're screwed. But on an implementation level, there's a long list of like, here's everything, all the inputs you take that if you're doing secure boot, you can't trust, right? And so, we took that outline and then we worked it out. And then we said, because the really cool thing about a lot of these sort of newer smart and IoT devices is that they tend to be Linux-based. And that means not everything, but a lot of it's going to be open source, including your bootloader or part of your boot process. So we're talking Grub and U-boot and a bunch of other things. And even though usually for each commercial device, it'll be like a modified U-boot. And so obviously the commercial modifications we didn't talk about, but U-boot itself is entirely open source. So Joe and I were like, oh, great. There's something we worked on that we can actually talk about publicly. And so we just for diversity, we added a bunch of others in there. But one of them was U-boot. And another one similar like that was Eufy and Tiano Core and a few other bootloaders. And so anyway, we kind of filled in all the gaps and we did the presentation. And as I mentioned before, one of the like long list of things that we talked about was sort of the DMA and like DMA attack surface. And Joe and I were like, well, I mean, that alone is a whole presentation. We can't do it for the bootloader stuff. And so after we, the second or third iteration of, as I sort of described my process earlier, by V3 of the bootloader presentation, we were kind of done with that. And Joe was like, hey, let's go do this DMA stuff. And I'm like, okay, sweet, let's do it. Let's go dig into that. And it's funny because if you look at a lot of the like embedded SOCs, in a lot of cases, they actually go out of their way because if you design your own board, you can, within limitations, you can kind of pick and choose what you put on your board. And so in a lot of cases, you can avoid DMA if you build a thing from scratch. But not always. There are cases where you're stuck with DMA. And so a relatively small subset of the things we had looked at before did have a device that was DMA capable, PCI or what have you. And so we had looked at one right before that was lots of DMA and had an IOMMU and lots of IOMMU related bugs in there. And from there, we're like, okay, let's go look at a bunch of open source stuff and look at all of the different ways that this can be screwed up. Like we had an idea of what it would look like based on an engagement we'd done before and another one we did before that. But that one was much more exploratory where we said, okay, let's go. And initially we had a long list, but we narrowed it down to just Linux and FreeBSD because those two alone have just, over 1,000 drivers that do some kind of DMA stuff. So all the things we ever needed, we got out of Linux. And then for some diversity, we threw in some FreeBSD. And so we came up with, initially, I think it was a list of like 13 different things that can go wrong with DMA. And so at the outset of our presentation, we say, okay, what we're looking at here is this, right? Because there's different levels of IOMMU where you can screw up, right? One is the IOMMU itself, like the hardware device. You can totally have bugs in there, and I guarantee you there are bugs in there. But we said, okay, that's too proprietary. That's too much effort. We're going to step on toes. We're not going to do that. And then the second we said, okay, the platform itself. And we said, okay, well, for the most part, we're probably not going to look at that. And we do hint towards some platform IOMMU issues. But the one we really looked at was sort of okay, what if you have some kind of DMA capable driver, a DMA capable device, and you're writing a driver for this stuff, and there's an IOMMU, and you're forced to use it. What are all the ways in which you can screw up, right? And so within a few weeks, we were like, okay, we think we have a pretty complete list of here's all the things that are people commonly screw up and that we've seen based on those 2 other engagements we had done that we had seen people screw up. And then sort of we start illustrating that with, okay, here's this driver in Linux and this driver in Linux, this driver in FreeBSD that had all of these issues. And then we worked that out. And then by V1, we had all of that. And this V1 was at the Congress. And I remember the CC conference has this very nice speaker room, which is if you ever spoken at CC before, most conferences don't have this or not as nice, but the CC conference can certainly times when the talks are just over gets really crowded. And the speaker room is this very nice, chill, relatively big room where you can sit and just chill and hook up your laptop and just kind of work on your stuff. And there's I mean, not extensive, but there's like free sandwiches and there's like some free drinks. I mean, not extensive, but like a free bottle of water and stuff like that. So you can just hang out and chill and work on stuff. And I think Joe and I, the CC is a 4-day event, and I think Joe and I spoke on the 3rd day. So we had the first 2 days that we just we hung out in the speaker room, and we kind of went over a presentation, and we're like, okay, well, you know, it would be real nice if we could actually like work on a demo, right? And basically a day before the or V1 of our presentation, we hacked in a demo, and we had a full demo going, where you could leak some data back and forth. So you get some initialized data, and then we worked it out to the point where we were able to leak actual SSH creds out over DMA. And so then we presented that at the Congress, and oh yeah, and then so now we're working on V2, and basically we have a second demo, which is basically there's these one of the DMA bugs is this, right? So let's say you have a piece of memory that you want to share, and you say and you do an alloc and you don't clear the buffer, right? And then you share that, you make that page readable and writable by device, and obviously you have an info leak. A quote-unquote cheap way to get around this without actually clearing the memory is to say, okay, let's be clever, and instead of taking the hit of clearing the memory, what we're going to do is, because we're really giving that buffer to the device to write, we don't ever need the device to read it. So you just set the, you go to the IOMMU, depending on which IOMMU you're using, you go to IOMMU and you say, hey, device can write to this but not read to it, right? And the idea is that, oh, haha, you know, I'm so clever, the device can no longer info leak, even though I didn't have to pay the price to clear this memory. And the problem there is a device, in particular in our use case, we said a NIC can go back to the kernel and say, hey, I wrote 15 bytes into this piece of memory, go deal with it. And you don't actually write anything, right? So that means the thing that was initialized is now being handled as data. So that's already bad. And then Joe and I started thinking, and we're like, okay, how can we turn this into an actual info leak? And the cool thing about a NIC is that you're going to have to implement the TCP stack. So we just did ICMP ping. And so whatever I give you, you automatically send back to me. Like your network stack does that by default, right? Mm-hmm. And so we basically, we send this slightly forged ICMP packet that says, hey, the amount of data that I want you to echo back is, I think, several hundred bytes. And then we truncate the packet short, and the rest of it is uninitialized data. And then when we get the response back, we just open TCP dump, and then inside TCP dump, we see the info leak. And we demoed that, and we created a POC for that. And sure enough, you open up TCP dump, and if you keep that continuously going, you'll see like, you know, XML files come by, you'll see config files come by, you see like random stuff typed on the console come by. So that worked out really well. And we're working on some other demos because we're thinking of doing a V3, maybe CanSec, maybe not. But there's a third demo in the works, but it hasn't not completed yet, so I don't really want to talk about it yet. Just don't want to ruin the surprise there. But yeah, in essence, that's the sort of the DMA presentation that me and Joe did. I hope people have liked it. I think because, you know, when we had one of the things we had with IOMMU is that initially it was sort of seen as this thing like you turn it on and then you're all good, right? And that was sort of the first revision of it. And then Thunderclap came around and said, no, hold on, actually, it's more than that. You know, you have this padding stuff, and that's also a problem, right? And actually, before that, in the some PS4 hacking in 2016, it turns out some of that stuff had was presented there as well. But that's as far as it went. And so me and Joe were like, no, there's so much more there. And we can't even get the trivia IOMMU stuff right. We're almost at the point where that's correct. But it turns out there's a long road ahead. Like, it's not enough to just turn it on. It's not enough to just get the alignment right. There are, like, your drivers have to do it right, and they currently don't, right? And my thinking is, or at least I think this is mostly for historic reasons, right? Up until very recently, DMA was not considered attack surface, right? The idea was that your device is going to behave, and so I don't have to validate anything because they can trample over memory anyway. And so when you look at drivers that are actively maintained but were written in that era, which is 99% of them, there are just endless amounts of these bugs. Now, if you look at newer drivers, and so actually Joe and I earlier this year did a little bit of a boot ROM review for a device I can't mention, but they did have DMA and they did have IOMMU, and that driver was clearly written attack surface in mind, and so they did almost everything right. There was a small info leak, but besides that, it was very clear that that driver did DMA, but they knew they were attack surface, and so the driver was of much higher quality. But the problem is sort of the not every device is new, right? Lots of things are going to reuse old drivers, like it'll be a V3 or a V4, but you use the same reference driver, right? And so moving forward, if we're going to see the DMA as attack surface and we're going to use the IOMMU, then we have to get the drivers right. And at the present time, the drivers are really, really bad because they're most of them were built in a time when it just wasn't a trust boundary, right? I mean, that's sort of in a nutshell, sort of where that present what Joe and I did on that.
So I have a couple more specific questions from that talk. So one thing was you stress getting alignment right. You just mentioned it now, and you mentioned it in the talk. Also, you stressed, the number one thing in your list of things not to do is like don't screw up the alignment. But most of the actual bugs aren't related to the alignment.
Yeah, so that's true. That's fair. So it's one of 13 was the alignment, because that's the most trivial thing that shows up, and that's in fact that's what Thunderclap was, right? So we didn't want to spend,
okay.
So we didn't want to spend too much time on that because that was already done. I mean, we mentioned it,
see.
And I think we had a demo for that as well, but we didn't go too crazy with that because it was like, I mean, the Thunderclap guy folks did like a ridiculously good job with it. I mean, the whole thing they pocked with those mbuffs where they get that free pointer, that was beautiful. Like there's not much you can't add to that, right? So we decided we should mention it because obviously it is important, and it's actually a really big problem because you're at the cross section of like your platform APIs, because generally when you build these drivers for whatever device you're using, you don't program the IOMMU yourself. You tend to use the platform APIs for that, right? And so ideally what you want is the platform APIs to give you a way that you can't screw it up, but none of them have. So all of them basically work in the way where they go like, oh, you go malloc a piece of stuff, now you give it to our DMA APIs, and we'll go program the IOMMU. But if the thing I malloc isn't aligned to the same granularity as the IOMMU, then that delta is a problem, right? And so you as the driver writer can't do something about that unless the APIs, give you the ability to do that. Otherwise, you're stuck with, I have to know the alignment of my IOMMU, and then I got to program. I got to do my malloc on the same alignment. I got to memset it at the same alignment. So currently, the problem is more of a like the platform has to help you out here. There's some progress there, but yeah.
I wanted to drill into one other thing that's related to this that you mentioned in your talk, but this was kind of surprising to me because I hadn't really. I've looked at some DMA attacks and some IOMMU or IOMMU attacks, but not really from the code and the operating system point of view. So this was actually new to me, which is that just allocating memory through an IOMMU, if you're worried about DMA, there's a race condition there. Right. So just the kind of basic how you allocate memory correctly has changed because of IOMMUs. And I thought that was really interesting.
That's absolutely true. So I mean, if you're using IOMMU, it's technically a two-step process, right? A is I allocate memory, right? And by depending on how you program IOMMU, but in the sort of secure boot kind of sense, the way you want to do this is you want to basically say, okay, by default, if I turn on the IOMMU and I program it correctly, as in I have a DMAR table with nothing in it, that means by default no devices get the DMA in, right? The IOMMU is going to say whatever address you give me, it's not in the list, and it's going to boot you, right? And then anytime you have a driver or some other program that says, okay, I have this piece of memory, I now want to share it with a device. That's a two-step process. One, A is you do the malloc, you allocate it whatever way you want, and then once you have the alloc, you go to the IOMMU and you say, hey, here's the address, here's the length of the thing, here's the device I want to have access to it, and here's read or write, right? And obviously you do that through platform APIs, hopefully, but that is sort of the general process of thing. And the idea is people will do this, and then they'll say, okay, alloc, they do program the IOMMU, and then the third step, we clear the memory, right? Now, obviously, if you clear the memory after you've mapped it, after you've programmed an IOMMU, there's a race condition there, right? Now, it may be, of course, until you give the address to the device, it doesn't know the address. But unless your memory allocator is super random, you can take a guess, or you can keep brute forcing, keep triggering behavior, keep brute forcing it until you hit the right page before you get the address. And then it's just a matter of hitting that race window, right? So there's definitely a race there. And what's really interesting is that, and again, this sort of comes back to platform APIs. This is, for example, this is a thing on Windows. A bunch of the NDIS APIs have this, where inside the platform APIs, they did it wrong, where they do the alloc, they do the map, and then they do the memset, right? Or they do the alloc, they do the map, and then they assume you have to do the memset, right? Well, if that's if the platform doesn't alloc a map and it gives me back a pointer, then even if I memset it, I have a race condition by design, right? So that becomes a problem where I, as a driver writer, can't get around this. I'm always stuck with this broken API. The platform needs to fix it, right? And that race condition happens is incredibly common, right? So any way you look at it, either whether you have it in your own code or whether it's based on platform APIs, those things happen all the time. It's ridiculous. There's more cases where it's done wrong than there are cases where it's done right.
What is the risk of that mistake?
Right. So that basically, the info leak is basically this, right? You get to read a piece of memory that's not initialized, right? And this is sort of what we call a classic info leak. And usually info leaks is sort of in its infancy, and it has been for way too long. It's been used very effectively for to bypass ASLR to get addresses out of it. But it turns out info leaks, if you play around with things, you can actually just use the info leak to turn into a privesc, where depending on what you have access to and how you can massage things, you can totally get creds out of this stuff. So one of the demos we have is just a straight up info leak, where we get SSH creds out of the thing, right? So the idea is that if you massage things in the right order, in the right direction, at the right time, it's not just a random piece of memory. It'll be your SSH memory buffers, right? The demo we had was my buddy Joseph SSH into a machine he has, and his username is Drugi, and his password is let me in 123, right? And we trigger this thing enough times, and sure enough, in plain text over DMA, we see your SSH data, and it says username Drugi, password let me in 123, right? And so when you have, and I hope in the futures we'll see more of these kind of info leaks where people don't just go, oh, random piece of memory. They go, hey, we took these steps, and now it's not just a random piece of memory. It's actual creds, or it's your TDY buffer, and it's like I can use this thing as a keylogger, or it's your network buffers, and I can see your HTTP traffic.
So what do you do to kind of target the info leak philosophically?
Yeah, so that's very case dependent, right? So there isn't a very generic way of it's not like a heap overflow where there's metadata every time at the end or the beginning of a heap chunk. It's very much depends on your case. like one of the things where it's like, is there an automated process where I can trigger something that does something that I can do this? So for example, if let's say let's for a moment forget the DMA case, but let's say you're in a local situation, and you get some kind. Let's say it's a local kernel bug, and you have a kernel info leak of a heap buffer that's 512 bytes, right? Even in those cases, people just kind of go, oh, well, random piece of memory. But in fact, you could create a POC that basically keeps running SU over and over and over and over. And what that means is it will go read the shadow file. It'll create in the buffer cache. If you then flush it, it goes out of the buffer cache and goes back into it. And that's the process you can keep triggering and triggering and triggering. And then if you combine that with your info leak, you just keep info leaking until you hit that recycled page from the buffer cache that has your shadow file on it. And now you have your password hashes, right? So that is a process that is like very repeatable, very possible, very doable in that particular situation. For DMA stuff, it's obviously a lot trickier because you're looking at it from outside, like you don't have a local shell. So it's very context dependent. It's like, okay, can I get this driver, other drivers to do something that leaks something interesting, or that puts something interesting on the heap or stack that it doesn't clear, that I can then later leak out.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, it's a whole different list to be indexed, is understanding all of the different widgets that are available for a given kernel environment or runtime.
Oh, absolutely.
That will access the specific targets that you want to populate either the stack or the heap, and do so in an incremental fashion in order to stage memory in a way that will allow your leak to probabilistically output what you want.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So this has reminded me of the way I usually have to watch the videos of your talks, because you always have like way more information than will fit in the time, and you always have this attitude like, well, this is so obvious to me, and you do frame things and kind of set things up really well. But then as the talk goes by, you just kind of start talking faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
I end up having to be like, wait, and then back up 5 minutes and watch it again.
It's a problem of mine where I try to be explicit and not skip things and not be like, this is so easy, I should cover it. But then if you try to make things very explicit, then you easily get into this thing where it becomes a lot longer than an hour. Like right now, I'm making an internal presentation on like Linux driver auditing in general, because we get more and more engagements like that. And I'm not even halfway through, and it's like 89 slides of like, do this. It's like, there's no way that fits in an hour. Once this thing is done, I'm gonna have to go back and start cutting stuff. And like, how can I make things more succinct, but in a way that it's still there? Like that can be, maybe somebody has to listen to it twice or 3 times, but that it can be consumed. And to me, that's always been a problem, to like find that right trade-off or balance between how do I make this thing fit in an hour, and still have people be able to comprehend it in some way.
Well, I appreciate a high level of information density, So it's like I could always take your 50-minute talk and play it in slow motion or something, and that's fine.
Yeah, I don't know if I would initially have read Ben's commentary as a criticism. I think it was more just a recognition of the fact that some talks require more careful. No,
I was thinking we're definitely going to link your talks in the notes for this episode, and I just want people to know, going into watching the talk, that you're not expected to be able to keep up with it. Like, you can back up. It's fine. That's normal.
Great.
So one thing that's come up a few times that we didn't really go into is, so we've mentioned the CCC Congress a few times.
Yep.
And I know that I know you really like the CCC and CCC events. So another kind of legend of Ilja detail is you keep the wristbands on.
That's true. This is true. right now, because they do. I mean, I keep them on until they fall off, because eventually they break off. Right now, I have. Let's see. I got 7 of the wristbands. Although one of them is from Shaw 2017. But the oldest one I have on right now is, see, that's 31. I think it's either 30C3 or 31C3 that I currently have. I think it's 31C3. But yeah, I keep the wristbands on. I don't know why. It's just I used to cut them off, but then at some point I was like, might as well keep them on. And then it was still on the next year I went to the Congress, so I was like, okay, I'll have 2, and then I have 3, and then I have 4, and usually at around 5, 6, like the oldest one tends to fall off. Right now it's up to 7, which is crazy. I expect one. Yeah, there's one that's going to come off probably in the next couple of weeks or months, which is that's 32C3. So then,
Well,
31C3 is pretty. Oh yeah, 31C3 is about to fall off. So yeah, 31C3 is the oldest, and that's about to fall off.
Is it just because you like Congress so much you kind of like being reminded of it constantly?
I don't know. I think that's subconsciously that's probably part of it. I just at some point I decided I'm not going to take these off. Yeah, I know some
Congress
people
all
do
the time.
Yeah,
Congress
well,
never ends.
I guess some people do it when they go to concerts, because I've seen other people have those kind of wristbands. And like it wasn't a conscious decision. I just it was more like I was lazy. And at some point I was like, I'm just not going to cut. Let's see how long this stays on. And it turns out it stays on for a couple of years. There was one time a couple of years ago where I was very, very briefly detained at an airport where they had to cut them off. This is now probably, well, I say recently, I mean, this is probably now 2012. So 9 years ago. So that was the last time when they all went off. And it has since built up again. But yeah, there's currently seven of these wristbands.
So I always liked when we'd go into some kind of like business meeting or whatever at work, and there's all these like sort of stuffy executive types, and you could see them like your wrist would come out or whatever, and you could see them like register, oh, there's a bunch of stuff on this guy's wrist, and then make a conscious decision to pretend they didn't see anything, right? Because because you're such a valuable asset to a software project, people don't want to mess with you. You know?
I don't know. It's never caused problems. No one's ever been like, you have to cut this off, except for the one time I was detained for a day.
Yeah, well, the airport security doesn't care, but
yeah,
I always got a big kick out of that. Like people, like just seeing people be like they were so desperate to get you on their project. They're so happy you're there because you're this like legendary code auditor guy, and then they're just like, registering. There's a bunch of wristbands on there, and then they're afraid to bring it up.
I mean, so sometimes somebody does say anything, but it's never been negative. I guess, I mean, if I was in a corporate environment and somebody said, you must take them off, I probably would. I don't think I'd object too much.
Oh yeah, but you're just super nice and friendly and stuff, and they don't necessarily know that, right? Like,
yeah, I don't. Is it that unprofessional to have? I don't know if it comes.
I don't think so. I think it's cool.
Yeah, it's just I never did this cool thing. It's just it again. It was never kind of by design. It's just one day I just decided not to cut it off after the Congress, because there are, because I do watch for these things, because if they because these are actually really nice cloth wristbands, and so they're comfortable. Because you have these like shittier ones or cheap material or paper, and those like are uncomfortable. And so I mean, kudos to the Congress that they have comfortable wristbands. Because if they were uncomfortable, I would definitely cut them off. The one thing I do now have to kind of pay attention for, because now obviously I'm on the streak, so I got to keep it going. So the one thing I do ask when I go to Congress is I go like, hey, don't make it too tight, because if it cuts off circulation, obviously I'm going to cut it off. And usually at the Congress, they're sticklers for, well, if you ask for that, that means you're going to cheat. But like they see my 7 wristbands and they go, no, we trust this guy. Like he's on a streak, you know. So when I ask for it, I usually get it. But that's that's the one thing I kind of look out for.
Yeah, I always get. I don't like having anything on my wrists at all, so I always get them loose, and I don't. They're worried people are gonna like slip it off and hand it out the door to their friend or whatever, so they can avoid buying a ticket or get past not being able to get a ticket, which is actually a bigger problem these days. Yeah, I always take those things off immediately after leaving. But when I see yours, it's like a nice fuzzy reminder. It's like, oh yeah, Congress.
Yeah. No, it's I see it on a daily basis. It's nice.
Well, so I'm wondering. So you went. You did a bootloader kick that led to the IOMMU kick, and I'm wondering if you have, what's going to be in fashion next season.
Man,
or if you have any idea.
That's a good question. I have absolutely no idea. As I said, we're still kind of working on the V3 of the IOMMU stuff, which we're kind of shooting for CanSec, but we don't know if it'll come together by then. And I still have to talk to Drago, so we're not quite sure on that yet. There's a possibility I might submit it for Black Hat, but I'm not sure. And Black Hat tends to not want to take presentations that have been in any way, form, or shape been presented elsewhere. So that's still something that we're not sure about. But probably by mid this year or something, I'll be looking for something new. I have absolutely no clue what the next thing is going to be. I could give you some ideas, but 99% chance it won't be into that. Because it's one of these things where it's like, it's like once you hit on this magic thing, you go with it. But until you hit on that, you have no idea what it is. So, I mean, it's a great question. I don't really have any answers, though. Or did you mean more general in terms of what's going to be the attack of next year in general? Or
well, do you know?
If I knew, I'd tell you. I don't know. I mean, that's one of the things about this industry is that you could try to predict. I mean, lots of people do this, right? End of the year, they'll make next year predictions, and I'm sure it happens everywhere. But certainly in the industry, like every year, you're seeing on LinkedIn and Facebook and whatnot. I predict so and so next year, and then of course none of it happens, right? It's like when every year somebody predicts next year is going to be the year of Linux on the desktop. Yeah, that's not going to happen, right? It's like, oh no, but Chromebooks. Yeah, but that's Chromebook isn't really Linux. I mean, it runs the Linux kernel, but it isn't. Like, it's not Linux. It's not my Ubuntu. It's. So anyway, in short, I have absolutely no clue what the next thing is. I think anybody who thinks they know is full of shit. It's just when you're trying to make a prediction, it's. You can predict that your prediction is going to be wrong, and you're going to be right in that prediction. But whatever the next thing is, I don't think anybody knows.
Well, I mean, who knew like Exchange bugs were going to be so hot this year? Like,
exactly. Nobody knew.
You might as well go back 10 years, look at whatever was big then, and like to make a list of what was big 10 years ago, roll the dice and pick one at random, and be like, that could be it.
That's such a great point. There are on occasion these really big bugs where you go, hey, somebody had a bug just like it 10 years ago and nobody noticed. A great example that you just reminded me of was shell shock, right? The bash thing. So it turns out 10 years before shell shock, 2003, 2004, the Windows terminal, cnd.exe, had a bug just like that you could hit through CGIs on IIS. And it went by virtually unnoticed by anybody. And then 10 years later, almost the exact same buffer overflow in Bash, and the world went crazy.
Well, I think we're winding down. Is there a question you wish we'd asked you?
I don't know. I didn't really come into this expecting any specific question. I had listened to some of the podcasts before, so I had a general idea of what the format was going to be like, and I figured that we just have some kind of conversation. So I don't think there's any question I was looking for or thought you would ask. I thought they were great questions. I thought they were very pointed. You guys definitely did your research.
Well, Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. I have more of the backlog to go through. The IOMMU talk was fascinating. I've done a small bit of driver code review, but I picked up so much out of that. And again,
Awesome.
thank you for your time and your sort of effort and passion and driving a lot of things that affect a lot of people at scale forward in terms of moving the needle on security.
Yeah, that's always been like you and Kaminsky have that in common, where you're both kind of. I mean, I don't mean this in a bad way, but you're both kind of out to save the world. You know, like you're not interested in just pantsing people and like writing a bunch of exploits. You really focus your work on, trying to address like growing or like bad trends, growing trends in code quality, and then presenting it in a way that people can, fix them.
Cool. Yeah,
You know?
I appreciate that. I think Dan is even more like that than I am. But yeah, Dan and I mean, Dan and I get along really well. We worked on the same things, and we shared an office for a couple of years. And he was my boss for a long time at IOA. I was his boss for a very short period of time later on when we hired him as a consultant. And then if you believe in this kind of bullshit science stuff, we're both was it his birthday is February 7th and mine's February 8th. So what's that?
Hey,
Aquarius?
Mine's February 5th.
Oh well, there you go. So I think so if you believe so if you believe in that kind of bullshit, the stars align. We're all like-minded because our birthdays are close to each other. I don't think that means anything, but if you think it does, that may be why.
It means I might actually remember all of your birthdays now. Just like when it's my birthday, I'll just do a mass text "Happy Birthday."
Yeah, so because I know so
it's close enough.
Yeah, so Dan's the day before mine, and then my best friend from high school, his birthday is the day after mine. So I usually end up talking to Dan the day before my birthday. I end up talking to once a year my best friend from high school, the day after my birthday.
The age of Aquarius, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
I don't know what that actually means. I just remember it from the song. So if that turns out to be some weird thing, I didn't know. Awesome. Dan, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I was saving. There was an opportunity to work the question in, but I just sat on it and saved it till later. So one of the things that has always vexed me whenever I'm doing C and C++ code audits is if I never understood how people kept in their mind or cached in their mind all of the undefined behavior or compiler optimization quirks that arise for vulnerabilities.
Oof.
Like, do you just live in GCC and Clang, or like how?
No, I don't, man.
That's so hard for me.
Not just for you, man. I mean, if I knew the answer, I would tell you. It's the idea is this, right? At least my view is that you try as hard as you can to keep everything in mind, including compiler optimization, undefined behavior, and reading specs. But at the same time, you have to also account for the fact that your model is incomplete and that there are things that you're going to get wrong sometimes, right? So, I mean, the better you are at this, the better your mental model, the more often you'll be right. But guarantee you at some point there's going to be a gap somewhere and you're going to be wrong. So it's just keep in mind that whatever mental model you have is you try to expand it as much as possible and try to still keep it in your head. But at the same time, you have to keep in mind that it's not complete. And I mean, GCC internals that you brought up, I mean, that's just a huge pain in the ass. I actually, thank God, I've read very little GCC code. But so Ben mentioned earlier, I did a talk at Congress called MEMSAD, which is about how to clear memory securely in C, which is a well-known problem for decades. But the solution is very hard because this is where compiler optimization comes in mind. And so one of the ideas I had was, if the compiler optimizes this, how about I just find the optimization and get it to spit it out? And then that way it can warn every time it optimizes this out. And so in order to do that, I had to understand GCC internals. And there's this really, really thick and large book on GCC internals that I ordered, and I read it from from front to back. It took forever to try to understand GC internals. But once I read that book, I knew where to look for the optimizer. And for whatever reason, I at the time didn't actually implement the patch, but then I came to the Congress, and luckily, again, I was scheduled on the third day, but I kind of got a cold right when I got there, and so I decided to skip the first 2 days of the Congress. And because I got the cold and I was stuck in my hotel room, I ended up making my GC patch at the hotel room like a day before the Congress. So that's
awesome.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any tips and tricks on this. That's why I asked the question, is because I would actively love someone to raise me to a new plane of existence and how to keep these like front of mind, especially because I don't spend that much time in unmanaged native code review. Like I spend way more time in a bunch of other environments.
I actually have a tip for this. So because I'm kind of an idiot, I'm always looking for like shortcuts, and the ultimate shortcut for never having learned assembly right is Godbolt.
Yeah, Godbolt.
I was just about to bring it.
Godbolt
awesome.
is the best thing in the universe.
Awesome.
Really, Godbolt is amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
You don't have to remember. It's a website. You can also self-host it, and basically, it has every compiler on every architecture that I can think of that you can select from a drop-down. You write your C code on the left side of the window, and the assembly for the compiler you selected shows up on the right side, and you can change the optimization options in the parameters to Godbolt.
Yeah, and
so if you get good at Godbolt, you can cover up a lot of sins of never having studied something.
Yeah, and
sins of a lack of memorization.
If you want to know about weird optimization type stuff, the guy who makes Godbolt actually has done a number of presentations since making that website about all the weird shit he's run into. And like I remember one of his presentations, he had one of these demos where, before we had really good optimizing compilers, the idea is that developers would be clever and do all sorts of weird optimizations in C. And he ran through some of these and said, all of these things, you should stop doing this because the compiler does it, and not only does it do it, it does it better than you. Even in very complex situations where you think the compiler couldn't possibly do it better than you, it's still smarter than you.
Yeah, we'll have to find. Well, we should track down some of those. Matthew Godbolt talks and see if we can link them in the episode.
Yeah, they're on YouTube. You should definitely link them. They are mind blowing. I think I saw 2 or 3 of them, and I learned a ton from those things.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, so I recently had to write some assembly for the new Apple M1.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had done some ARM assembly, but like years ago, I didn't quite remember it. ARM 64 is a bit different.
Yep.
It's not that different as it turns out, but even before like bothering to pull up the ARM 64 ABI, I was just like, right to Godbolt. Like, how do I get Godbolt in ARM 64? And then I wrote the C equivalent of what I was trying to do. And then saw what it spit out, and then I basically just I had to figure out what I had to edit, because it adds some alignment stuff, so I had to like mess around with the optimization options, and but boy, that is a force multiplier on doing any kind of assembly or looking at the effect of compiler optimizations, especially on platforms you're not really that familiar with.
Yeah, 100%. Godbolt is fantastic.
So my takeaways from my question asked and the answers are: I'm in good company, and I've hit the 10,000 hour problem for native code review, and then really it's just a byproduct of practice and time sunk. But that's great, and yeah, we should definitely link Godbolt and all the any additional interesting talks that Matthew has in that space.
And one other thing that I was going to bring up. So you mentioned you were looking at fuzzing,
instruction
machine instructions.
Yep.
I was going to ask if you'd seen the project Sand Skimmer.
Sand Sifter?
Sand Sifter. Sand Sifter.
Sand Sifter.
Is
Sorry.
this? I know.
Sand
there was.
Skimmer is Star Wars, I guess.
This one- I
Sand
know-
Sifter is.
I remember seeing one Black Hat presentation about this 2 or 3 years.
Yeah,
or maybe-
it was a Black Hat presentation 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, I don't remember the details though. The name vaguely rings a bell, but I can't recall details. I'd have to look it up.
So we've been playing with that a little bit, and it's actually pretty cool. So I mean, there's definitely room for improvement in it. But basically, a guy wrote it's some Python code with some C, Python code to manage the C driver, and his focus was less on fuzzing so much as brute forcing kind of secret machine instructions or brute forcing machine instructions that are the same as other machine instructions, but because of like hardware optimization, if you flip one bit in the operator, it doesn't matter. You know?
I do remember.
It still behaves the same as the other one.
I vaguely. Yeah, now that you mentioned, I do remember that. I'd have to go back and look at it to get a really good impression of it. I can tell you what I've done so far from like my side, from the instruction set fuzzing type of stuff. And this is this is one of these things that goes back years. The very first version of this, because I had this idea in my early 20s, like, oh, we should fuzz the instruction set. And so my very first naive implementation was this, right? I just do like grab some bits out of def-view random. I fork, and then I take a function pointer, point at random bits, and run it, right? And then you keep that going in a loop. For the most, like 99.99999% of the time, you hit you hit an exception right away, which is illegal instruction, something that's just garbage. So, and the fact that a fork is relatively expensive is like, I can't do 2 million in a second because it's just it's way too heavy on the US side, right? But just that very first version of it, I hit a kernel panic in FreeBSD within a few minutes. Some stupid trap handler bug. And then I kind of left that, didn't do anything for that for years. And then I said, okay, I should go back to this. And so my second iteration of this was, if you look at the Intel and AMD manuals, it tells you what the instruction decoder is like. And of course, the Intel manuals, being what they are very intricate and obtuse and hard to read. But the AMD manual has this really awesome, huge 2-page graph that visually tells you what a decoder is. And so I looked at that decoder and said, okay, let me go write something that encodes for that decoder. And I had some success with that, but it was still a pain in the ass. And then I hit a few more bugs with that. I hit some bugs in parallels and a VMware bug and a few other things. And then just because I'm lazy, if I have to spend more than a few days writing code just to get an early prototype going, it's too much effort. Not to get it old, but just early prototype to get something out of it, right? And then a few months ago, I ran into this library called, I think it's XCD. It's from Intel, and it's literally an instruction encoder from Intel, which has numerous APIs to say, this class of instruction, these register so-and-so, jump or not, compare so-and-so. And obviously some of these apply to some classes, some of these apply to other classes. But my approach so far has been to just brute force my way through. I call all these APIs, I brute force a bunch of things. And if it spits out an actual byte stream, then I know I have some kind of weird valid instruction. And right now, the brute forcing is kind of slow, so there's lots and lots and lots of room for optimization. But so far, it looks like that might be a better approach than everything I've done before. Lots of things I still need to figure out, and I don't know if it'll pan out, but I think it has more potential than the previous things I've done.
Awesome. Well, I think we can leave it there.
Cool.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Yeah. This was amazing. Yeah, thanks again for taking the time to
not a problem,
to talk to us. I think there's there's really a lot of wisdom that you've shared today that I'm very, very excited about. Well, and with that, I'd also like to say thank you, as always, to Mitchell for doing all of our editing. And that's our whole credits reel. Thanks to everyone for listening, and we'll wrap it up. Now more than ever, hacking is not just a crime.
It's a survival trait.